Hey guys, tonight we're wandering back into the foggy forests of northern Europe to follow the footsteps and stomachs of the Vikings. You've heard the tales, right? Axe-swinging raiders, longships cutting through frozen fjords, drinking horns clinking under auroras. But let's be honest, none of that would have happened without food, and not the glorious feasting table kind. No, we're talking about the forgotten foods, the stuff that actually fueled them, the weird roots, the gritty porridge, the soup that maybe had squirrel in it? Maybe. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from and what time it is. Bonus points if you're lying in bed, fan humming in the background. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins with you rising early, just as the mist curls low along the forest floor. You're in what would one day become southern Norway, but for now it's just cold and damp. You throw on layers of wool and grab a woven basket. Today is foraging day, and that's not some pleasant picnic walk. It's about survival. Your winter stores are nearly gone, the hunting's been thin, and the fishing boats are iced in. So you join your clan's gatherer, a stout, mud-smeared woman named Era, into the woods, your feet squelching in half-frozen earth. Your first target, Angelica root. Not the fancy candied stuff. This is raw, fibrous, and smells like licorice crossed with swamp. You yank it up, brush off the mud, and Era nods. Good for stew, she grunts, or chewing when your teeth hurt. You move on to wild onions, tiny bulbed things that try hard to resemble food, and ramps which taste like garlic that just woke up angry. Then it's off to find wood sorrel, which has a bright lemony tang. The Vikings liked it for flavour, but also for its vitamin C. Scurvy? Not just a pirate problem. The Norse worried about it too, especially during long winters where anything green was a miracle. In a clearing, you kneel to pull mushrooms from beneath a damp log. Not the pretty supermarket kind. These are spindly, greyish things that grow in clusters, and you pray Era knows which ones won't kill you. She sniffs them, squints, then tosses one in her mouth like a dare. Good, she says, chewing slowly. You wait to see if she keels over. She doesn't. As you gather, Era explains how roots were more than just fillers. They were medicines, tools, and even rituals. Like valerian, used to calm nerves, or butterbur, which they used as a wrap for food or to treat fevers. Some roots even served as dye for woolen clothes, boiled into a murky potion that somehow coloured tunics without also melting them. But there's one you're warned to stay. Away from the deceptively pretty hellebore. Looks like it might taste like apple. It does not. It will, however, make your stomach fold in on itself until you politely exit this world. Still, there are rumours that some Viking seers used it in tiny doses during rituals to slip into trance states. Maybe to talk to the gods, or maybe just to hallucinate vividly about fermented fish. You pause at a small stream where fiddlehead ferns curl beside the rocks. These are tender green spirals that taste a little like asparagus, a little like dirt. You snap off a few and Era lights up. For the festival stew, she says. Festival? You glance at her sideways. What are we celebrating? She shrugs. Not starving. You smile. There's some dark honesty in that. The Vikings didn't always feast in great halls with roast boar legs and rivers of mead. Most days were thin, filled with whatever the land grudgingly offered. And when you think about it, the fact that they even managed to survive this climate is wild. They lived half the year in snow, half the year in mosquito-plagued bogs, and somewhere in between they managed to build ships, conquer England, and invent complex legal systems. All on a diet of boiled roots and pickled weeds. One quirky fact: Vikings actually grew a now-forgotten tuber called kavana in their gardens, Angelica's cousin. It was so important that the law once protected it. Stealing it from another family's patch could result in public shaming or fines. That's how seriously they took their root veggies, move-over potatoes. But not everything is so well understood. Scholars still argue about just how much of their daily food came from wild foraging, versus what they could grow or trade. Some believe they relied heavily on wild greens and roots, while others argue the archaeological record is skewed by preservation bias. After all, delicate plant matter doesn't fossilise well, so we're left piecing things together from seeds found in latrines and impressions left in pottery. Glamorous work. archaeology. You continue deeper into the woods, basket heavier now. Era stops beside a tree with gnarled bark and taps it lightly. Sap's ready, she says. She produces a tiny knife and cuts a shallow slit. You watch as a clear, glistening droplet forms and slides down into a wooden bowl. It's birch sap, light, slightly sweet, and full of minerals. Vikings drank it fresh in spring, or sometimes let it ferment into a mild, cloudy wine. You sip from the bowl and blink. It's cold, like drinking a snowflake. Not bad. Probably amazing if you hadn't eaten tree moss for 3 days straight. As the sun finally pushes through the tree line, you start heading back toward the village, arms tired and feet soaked. Your basket's full of odd, unlabeled nature bits. Roots, greens, a couple of mystery mushrooms, and whatever those fuzzy things were Era wouldn't identify. But somehow, it's comforting. This was life. Dirt under your nails, sore back, and a hope that your stew didn't poison the family. Tonight's meal won't be pretty. It might not even taste like food, but it will keep you alive. And in the Viking Age, that's more than enough. By now, you're back in the village, your shoulders aching from the basket and your stomach low-key growling. But Era's not done. Not even close. She hands you a little cup carved from horn. Thin, smooth, stained dark with age, and nods toward a bubbling pot near the communal fire. Try this, she says. Sap's not the only gift from trees. You peer into the mixture. It's not soup. It's thinner, translucent. You take a cautious sip. It tastes like smoke, and sugar had a very awkward date. That's birch sap again, but this time boiled down to syrup. Not quite as sweet as maple, but with a woody edge, like someone steeped syrup in an old leather boot. Still, in a world with no candy, this stuff's liquid gold. And that's just the start. You're about to learn just how weirdly resourceful the Vikings got with their forests. Trees weren't just shelter, they were pantries. The village healer, a wiry man named Halder, calls you over to his workshop. It smells like mouldy firewood and vinegar, and it's definitely the sort of place where something once died. On the table he's laid out pieces of bark, dry twigs, and a few mystery powders. This, he says proudly, handing you a slice of what looks like really sad jerky, is pine bark bread. You chew it slowly, very slowly. It doesn't taste like bread. It tastes like you made toast out of your childhood treehouse. Turns out when grains were low, and they often were, people mixed ground inner pine bark, the cambium layer to be precise, into their dough. It added bulk and a hint of sweetness. Sometimes it was just bark and water, dried into wafers so tough you could use them as shields. Not a delicacy, but again, not starving. You're starting to understand Viking cuisine isn't about flavour, it's about stubbornness. But not all bark was edible. Elm, poison, oak, too bitter. But birch, that one's a superstar. Beyond syrup, it provided mild sweetness in stews, made a decent tea, and could even be chewed like gum. The Vikings didn't have Tic Tacs, but they did have birch bark. Peppermint fresh. Number slightly woody with the texture of the old shoelaces? Yes. Later you walk with Halder into the forest again, this time with a different goal. He stops at a particular tree, the bark smooth and almost papery. He scrapes off a bit of what looks like a greyish-green crust clinging to the side. This is tree lichen, he explains, holding it gently like something sacred. If you boil it right, it won't kill you. You laugh. He doesn't. Boiled lichen made a thick, almost porridge-like food during the hardest winters. It had to be soaked, boiled, rinsed, and boiled again. Why? Because raw, it contains acids that irritate the stomach, or worse. But in a pinch, if prepared properly, it offered just enough calories to get through a cold night. Now, here's a fun fringe detail. Some Viking communities are believed to have eaten tree buds in early spring, particularly from birch and hazel trees. The buds are high in protein and packed with the kind of nutrients that stave off starvation. But they're also bitter and fuzzy, like chewing on tiny caterpillars. Still, after a 3-month diet of dried fish and regret, they were a treat. A more contentious debate, whether Vikings ever drank sap wine in ceremonial gatherings. Some archaeologists believe birch sap, when fermented naturally, created a mildly alcoholic drink, a sort of prehistoric kombucha. There's scattered evidence in old sagas and burial sites, but nothing definitive. It's possible it existed, but it may have been rare, seasonal, or used only in certain regions. Others think it's just enthusiastic interpretation of cloudy liquids found in jars. Still, you sip your cup of cold sap syrup and wonder what it would taste like with a few days of fermentation and a warm sun. Back in the village, a child hands you a handful of something brown and sticky. "Chew it," she says cheerfully. This is apparently a thing they give to newcomers. You pop it in your mouth. It's tree resin. Not exactly gum, but close. Vikings chewed spruce or pine resin to clean their teeth, freshen breath, and, let's be honest, because they were bored. It softens with heat and takes on a piney flavour that sticks around long after the fun stops. Archaeologists have found lumps of ancient resin with tooth imprints still intact. Viking chew toys, if you will. As the sun sets, the village gathers around the longhouse fire. Dinner tonight is a tree-heavy affair. Birch syrup is drizzled over roasted turnips and stewed greens. You watch as someone adds a handful of bark flour to a bubbling pot. There's even a kind of dessert. Dried apples, preserved in honey and wrapped in soaked birch leaves. It smells earthy, slightly fermented, and definitely healthier than anything at the corner store. But you can't help noticing how many tree products ended up in everyday meals. Bark, sap, leaves, resin, nothing went to waste. Where modern kitchens might see kindling, the Vikings saw calories, and medicine, and tools, and when times got especially bleak, full-on meals. There's something almost poetic about it if you're not gagging on resin. Trees didn't just frame their houses or fuel their fires, they fed their kids, literally. From sap to root to bud, the Viking relationship with the forest wasn't just practical, it was intimate. You stretch your legs and lean back against a log. Your stomach is full in that "I'm not hungry, but I can't name what I ate" sort of way. Your fingers smell like pine. Your teeth might never be clean again, but somehow it all fits. This life, scraping, chewing, boiling, and improvising. It's survival, sure, but it's also something else. It's resourcefulness wrapped in bark. It's dinner with the forest. And it's weirdly comforting. The next morning, before your eyes are even fully open, the smell hits you. Briny. Fishy. With a top note of something sour that might once have been alive but now mostly smells like the bottom of a tide pool. You sit up slowly, still wrapped in a wool blanket that itches like 1,000 angry squirrels, and blink toward the smoke hole in the ceiling. Yep, that smell is breakfast. Again. Outside, the sun barely peeks over the frostbitten hills. You shuffle toward the shore where a few villagers are already busy with nets and baskets. This isn't the romantic Viking vision of spear-hurling warriors slaying whales. No, today's catch is less glamorous. Sea squirts, lump suckers, dogfish, and little wriggling things scooped straight off the rocks. The ocean's fringe crew. You walk up just as a woman named Brynhild stabs a knife into what looks like a soggy sponge. "Sea squirt," she mutters, splitting it open and pulling out a translucent jelly-like core. She hands it to you. "Go on." You don't go on. You hesitate. You try to find a polite way to ask, "Is this poison?" without sounding rude. But Brynhild's already popping one into her mouth like it's a grape. You close your eyes and do the same. It bursts between your teeth with a flavour somewhere between seawater, phlegm, and regret. She laughs. You get used to it. These weird sea creatures were an overlooked staple of coastal Viking diets. Anything that could be scraped, scooped, or pried off a rock went into the pot. Mussels, limpets, barnacles, heck, even sea cucumbers on rare occasions. Not exactly feast food, but rich in protein and minerals, and when dried, they kept well for winter. Then comes the dogfish. It's not cute. It's not small. It's a miniature shark with the facial expression of something that wants you to step on a Lego. Brynhild hauls one up from a tangled net, slices it open, and extracts the liver. "Best part," she says, smearing some of the oil onto her palm like it's lotion. We eat the rest too, but the liver's for energy. You help clean it, and the smell is robust. The oil is thick and yellow, used in stews or sipped straight for warmth and stamina. Rich in nutrients, sure, but it feels like you've swallowed a spoonful of motor grease. You imagine Viking warriors on their longships, bracing against Arctic winds, with dogfish liver lining their stomachs like a protective oil slick. Not the worst idea. Then there's the fermented stuff. Out behind the smokehouse is a pit. A real pit. Dug into the rocky ground, lined with seaweed covered in stones. The stench radiating from it makes your nostrils fold inward in self-defense. Brynhild walks over casually, lifts the stone lid and grins. Fermented skate. You've heard of this. Vikings took certain fish, shark, skate, ray, buried them underground, let them break down in their own ammonia-rich juices, and then dug them up weeks or months later. And yes, they absolutely ate it. Still do, in parts of Iceland. She offers you a slice. You try to breathe through your mouth. It doesn't help. The taste is something like chewing a sweaty rubber glove dipped in vinegar and death. It burns going down. It keeps burning. And somehow, people liked this. Not just liked, considered it special, an acquired taste that signalled strength. Only the bold dared eat it, or maybe only those who'd lost all sense of smell. Quirky side note. Fermented skate was sometimes served to honoured guests, not as a prank, as a treat, a delicacy. A way of saying, we respect you so much, we're giving you this meal that might melt your sinuses. It's almost sweet. Back in the village, lunch is a fish stew, but not a clean-cut salmon fillet kind of stew. No, it's got fins, bones, skin, maybe a few pebbles, and something gelatinous that looks suspiciously like eyeball. The broth, though, is rich and layered, simmered with seaweed, wild onions, and that miraculous birch sap again. And despite everything, it's good. Weirdly satisfying, deeply savoury, with the kind of warmth that pushes out through your ribs. You learn that Vikings used every part of a catch. Fish skins were dried and turned into tough waterproof crackers for travel. Fish guts flavoured stews. Fish bones were ground into powder for broth. Even the heads, including the cheeks and eyes, were prized bits. A Viking grandma might hand you an eyeball the way your own might pass you a candy. Refuse, and you're just being rude. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about how widespread these lesser sea delicacies were. Some argue that only coastal communities indulged in fermented fish and gelatinous marine creatures. Others believe dried and preserved sea goods were traded inland more frequently than we think. One Norse settlement in Greenland shows signs of eating more shellfish than meat, while others appear to have relied on dried cod stockfish transported hundreds of miles. It's hard to say for sure, but it's clear that if it came from the sea, it was fair game. You walk by a drying rack stacked with strips of something pale and leathery. Fish jerky. Thin slices of dogfish, herring and eel, sun-dried into chewy survival snacks. They last for months and can be rehydrated in soups or chewed straight like Viking beef jerky. A pouch of these would have gone into a warrior's satchel right next to the whetstone and the bone comb. You chew on a strip while watching the waves crash against the black rocks. It's tough, salty, slightly fishy, but not bad. Not anymore. Maybe it's the cold air, or the fact that you're 6 meals deep into a seafood-heavy diet and your taste buds have surrendered. But you're starting to get it. Viking cuisine wasn't elegant. It wasn't delicate. It was efficient. It made use of everything. It preserved energy, stored sunlight, and gave you strength to row a ship for 12 hours straight. Every weird sea creature, every fermented puck of horror, every oil-slicked liver had a purpose. You head back into the village, still chewing, eyes watering slightly from the fermented skate fumes still stuck in your sinuses. And somehow, in all this strangeness, there's a rhythm, a system, a flavour of survival, sour, salty, and stubborn. By the next morning your mouth still tastes faintly of sea creature, and not the noble kind, like grilled salmon with lemon. No, it's more like low tide in July. But don't worry, you're about to switch gears. Today, your taste buds get a break. A questionable break. Because we're leaving behind the dogfish and heading into the world of Viking drinks and animal oddments. You're invited to a small gathering inside a smoke-darkened longhouse, where a few villagers have gathered to brew, chew and talk nonsense. At the centre of it all is a heavy wooden tub filled with something dark and bubbling. It's not mead, not this time. This is ale, but it's not made with hops. The Vikings didn't have those yet. Instead, this batch is brewed with bog myrtle and yarrow, herbs you probably associate with hedge witches, not happy hour. You're handed a horn cup and told to drink up. It smells herbal and musty like someone boiled a meadow. You take a sip. Okay, so, it's not bad. It's earthy, a little sour, with a vague floral bitterness and a back note of pine, soap, regret. The bog myrtle gives it a medicinal tang that actually cuts the funk pretty well, and yarrow brings in this dry bitterness that sticks to your tongue. There's a mild alcohol warmth, just enough to make you think, Well, maybe one more. This, apparently, is the everyday drink. Mead is saved for special occasions, weddings, battles, funerals and boasting contests. But bog ale? This is the stuff you guzzle after a long day gathering sea squirts or scraping moss off bark. And of course, no Viking drink is complete without food. Someone passes around a wooden tray with dried strips of lamb lung. Not lamb, lamb lung. They've been smoked, salted, and re-dried to chewy perfection. You bite in and it's surprisingly okay, like jerky but airier, less meaty, more spongy. It gives your jaw a workout, but the flavour is salty and savoury, with a weird mineral edge that lets you know you're eating something internal. Another tray comes around, this time with little cubes of something greyish and firm. Boiled liver and blood cubes, says a boy who looks way too excited about this. You pop one in, expecting horror, but the taste is mild, almost bland. A soft texture, somewhere between tofu and cold scrambled eggs, with an iron-rich tang that reminds you, yeah, this used to flow. By the fire, an older man begins a story about the time he got so drunk on bog ale that he mistook a seal for a sea spirit and tried to wrestle it. No one questions the story. Instead, someone passes around a jug of something thicker, sour, tangy and white. This is sour whey ale. It's made by combining leftover whey from cheese-making with grains and letting it ferment. The result is a protein-rich drink that tastes like someone pickled bread in old milk. You sip carefully, it's tart, it fizzes slightly, not undrinkable. And frankly, after fermented skate, your standards are off the charts. Now here's a curious historical footnote. Some Viking brewers added herbs not just for flavour, but to enhance dreams or visions. Herbs like henbane or mugwort were sometimes tossed into ale or mead to open the mind, though others argue that might have been accidental poisoning. Either way, you stare into your horn cup and wonder what a bog myrtle trip would feel like. Probably something between wild bear hallucination and puking behind the longhouse. The debate continues today. Some scholars believe these ales were stronger than we give them credit for, rich in sugars and alcohol content, while others suggest they were low ABV drinks, consumed more like kombucha than cocktails. Archaeological digs have uncovered traces of ancient brewing setups, including massive ceramic vats and carbonized barley. But the exact recipes, gone. Just guesses remain. As the fire crackles and the ale works its slow burn, a few villagers gather ingredients for what they jokingly call a Viking charcuterie board. It includes dried lung, salted goat tongue, fermented curds, and these thin, cracker-like pieces of dried milk skin. That's right, milk skin. Boiled milk cooled, skimmed, dried, and eaten like a wafer. It crackles like thin plastic and tastes like overcooked pudding skin. Not bad, actually. Strange comfort. Then someone brings out the big bowl. Blood pancakes. Yes, pancakes. Made with grain flour, milk, and animal blood. Fried on a hot stone until crispy. You bite in. It's savoury, dense, and kind of delicious, in a don't-ask-what's-in-it way. The blood gives it richness, almost a meaty flavour, and it's topped with a little smear of sour cream. Dessert? Debatable. Breakfast? Absolutely. One of the elders explains how using blood was both practical and symbolic. You only got fresh blood after a slaughter, and wasting it was unthinkable. So they used it in sausages, porridges, pancakes, anywhere it would bind or enrich a meal. They even had rituals tied to blood meals, especially during seasonal festivals or harvest slaughters. There's an ancient Norse poem that mentions the Red Feast, believed by some to reference communal blood dishes prepared during winter feasts. Others argue it's poetic exaggeration, or even metaphorical. But when you're holding a plate of blood pancakes, the line between poetry and menu gets blurry. Before you turn in for the night, someone offers you one final concoction, a bowl of cold ale mush. It's basically barley porridge mixed with leftover beer, sometimes served warm, sometimes cold. It's chunky, sour, slightly fizzy. You try it, then you try another spoonful, and just like that, you get it. This is Viking comfort food. This is hangover cure, breakfast, and lazy dinner all rolled into one goopy bowl. You lie back on a fur-covered bench, stomach full of odd textures and flavours, brain buzzing lightly from herbal ale. Outside, the wind whistles low over the thatched roofs. You can hear the sea, you can still taste lamb lung in the back of your throat. But weirdly, You're satisfied. Somehow, in a world of drying racks, smoked blood and bog ale, you've started to feel at home. You wake up to the sound of someone pounding grain against stone. Not the rhythmic kind of pounding either. It's chaotic, like someone arguing with the earth. Outside, the early light filters through the smoke hole again, throwing stripes across your blanket. Your mouth feels like it's been lined with wool, and your breath probably smells like goat, because last night you had blood pancakes, lung jerky, and that mysterious ale that may or may not have included wild yarrow. You roll out of bed and follow the sound. At the edge of the longhouse, two women are kneeling beside a quern, basically a giant stone donut stacked on another stone donut. They're rotating it by hand, slowly grinding ancient grains into something that might eventually become food. You've eaten bread your whole life. You know what it looks like. Golden, fluffy, yeasty, full of gluten-induced joy. This is not that. Viking bread was more like a suggestion of bread. Or maybe a warning. The grains they're grinding are barley and rye, not wheat. Wheat was expensive, imported, and unreliable in these climates. Barley, on the other hand, grew like a weed. It was tough, dependable, and tasted, well, like something you'd eat if wheat were a distant rumour. You reach in and touch the flour. It's gritty, coarse. Little shards of stone mix with the grain because the grindstones aren't exactly precision tools. Over time, people's teeth literally got ground down by this kind of flour. You'd chew your way through your daily ration, and your molars would slowly vanish. Viking dental records? Kind of a horror show. They add water to the mix and shape it into flat, thin discs. These aren't loaves. These are hard, dense, unleavened cakes, more like edible coasters. You watch as they slap them onto hot stones near the fire. No oven, no rise, no crust. Just heat, patience, and survival. You try a bite. It crunches. It's slightly smoky, definitely dry, and somehow still warm and comforting. You chew for a while, then chew some more. It's less delicious, and more, I will not die today. And this is just the breakfast version. There were variations. Griddle cakes made with leftover ale mash, porridge-style gruel made from barley and milk, and even something called seed bread, where they mixed ground grains with seeds, nuts, and herbs. All functional, none of them remotely fluffy. Someone adds a smear of cheese to your barley cake. It's sharp, slightly sour, and smells like a barn floor. But it helps. The salt cuts the dry mouthfeel, and suddenly, this little hard bread becomes fuel, calories, energy, life. Here's the cool part. Viking bread had ritual significance too. During seasonal festivals or funerals, bread was baked into shapes, round like the sun, spiral like the world tree, or broken and shared in silence. Some burial sites include hardened bread lumps buried alongside the dead, maybe snacks for the afterlife, maybe spiritual offerings, maybe just a really bad last meal. There's also some historical debate about leavening. Did the Vikings know how to make rising bread? Some scholars think yes. Wild yeast from the air could have been cultivated through sourdough-like processes, but others argue that outside of rare feast days, most daily bread was flat, fast, and hard enough to double as a throwing weapon. The archaeological record shows both possibilities, so you chew and wonder whether someone somewhere had a fluffy slice of Viking focaccia. Probably not. Next, they show you something special. Oven bread. Not a fancy clay oven, mind you, just a pit lined with hot stones and covered with turf. A flatbread goes in, buried for an hour, then dug out. The crust is charred, the middle's still chewy. It smells incredible. It's infused with ash, smoke, and dirt, but in the best way, like an accidental pizza made by druids. The ingredients are minimal. Barley flour, water, salt, maybe a little honey if it's spring and the bees are generous. Occasionally they toss in ground acorns or peas to stretch the dough, especially in lean years. These additions weren't culinary flair, they were desperation strategies. You look at the loaf and imagine someone grinding acorns at midnight while praying for rain. Later in the day, you get roped into making porridge. Not the creamy breakfast kind. This one's barley, water, and turnip shavings. Maybe a dried apple slice if you're lucky. You stir it over the fire until it thickens into something resembling mortar. You eat it with a spoon carved from horn. It sticks to your teeth and tastes like warm dirt with a hint of sadness. But again, it fills you up. That's the point. And here's the quirky bit. Viking porridge wasn't always savoury. Sometimes it was sweetened with honey or birch syrup. A pudding of sorts. if you squinted and had no other desserts in your life. There's even a chance they mixed beer into it, not just to soften the grains, but to preserve it a bit longer. Beer porridge, the Viking version of overnight oats but drunker. In one corner of the longhouse, someone's drying leftover grain mush into thin cakes. Travel rations, dry, brittle, packed with carbs. Not tasty but portable. These would have been perfect for long voyages. Just dunk in water, stir with whatever you've got, and voila, sadness soup. A young girl hands you a small pouch. Inside are little nuggets of dried mash. "For the road," she says, grinning. You nod, trying to act grateful, but you know that in about 12 hours you're going to be chewing on one of these and wishing you still had fermented skate instead. But by the end of the day, something shifts. You realise the Vikings didn't just survive on these basic gritty foods, they mastered them. They found ways to stretch their ingredients, preserve them, flavour them with what little they had. Bread wasn't comfort, it was currency, ritual, armour, and somehow they made it taste like life. You lie down with your belly full of flatbread and barley mush, listening to the night wind curl around the eaves. You think about teeth worn down by stone-ground flour, of oven pits carved from frozen soil, and the quiet pride of a hard-earned crust. It's not fancy, it's not soft, but it's real. And tomorrow, you'll chew it all again. It's a grey morning, which means it could be any time of day, really. You step outside, breathe in the chilled air, and it smells like damp wool and the faint rot of composting turnips. In the distance, a woman waves you toward the marsh. She's got a basket, a thick scarf wrapped around her mouth, and an expression that says, "This is going to be squishy. Welcome to berry season, Viking style." The bog is silent except for your feet squelching through the mud, and the occasional buzz of something with wings and no manners. You start to notice tiny splashes of colour in the brown-green wilderness. Reds, purples, deep blues, cloudberries first, orange gold and soft, looking like mutant raspberries. They're delicate, juicy, and packed with vitamin C, which means they're basically Viking medicine disguised as candy. You pop one into your mouth and it explodes in tart sweetness. You blink. It's good, like actually good. Cloudberries were rare and only grew in the wild, which made them valuable. In some cases, they were stored in wooden jars and buried in peat to preserve them for winter. Some accounts even suggest they were offered as tribute to local chieftains. Imagine travelling across a frozen bog just to deliver a jar of squishy berries. But hey, worth it. These little golden gems might have been the closest thing to joy during a 5-month snowstorm. Next, you spot crowberries. Dark, shiny, and suspiciously bland. You try one. It tastes like nothing, maybe a hint of dirt. But they were abundant, and the Vikings weren't picky. Mix them with other ingredients, grain, honey, fermented milk, and they became part of larger dishes. Or, dried out and used in stews, they offered bulk and trace nutrition. Not a flavour bomb, but better than bark. Then you find lingonberries, small, tart red ones that fight back when you bite. These were prized, eaten fresh, dried, or boiled into. Sauce, not the IKEA kind, more the "I almost starved this winter but found this bag of tiny red miracles" kind. You watch as your basket slowly fills with a mix of the forest's finest and most underwhelming fruits. You learn that not all berries were safe. Some, like baneberries or snowberries, looked tempting but were deeply poisonous. Viking kids were taught early to know the difference, because one handful of the wrong berry and you weren't just grounded, you were buried. In a rare moment of sun, you squat beside an older woman named Gudrun, who's mixing dried berries into a leather pouch with crushed oats and a little honey. "Trail cakes," she says, "sweet and strong." You taste a bit from her hand. It's chewy, a little sour, a little nutty. Energy packed into a portable, vaguely fruity lump. These were taken on hunting trips, long sails, even into battle. Fuel, not dessert. And here's where things get weird. She pulls out another pouch, smaller, wrapped in waxed birch bark. Inside, fermented berry mash. It smells like someone dropped fruit into a sweaty boot and waited 3 weeks. Used to ward off fever, she tells you, or summon dreams. You hesitate, but she already has a tiny wooden spoon pressed into your palm. You taste it. It's sharp, deep. Like sour wine and medicine had a passionate, chaotic fling. Supposedly, Vikings used fermented berries medicinally, but some believe they also played a role in rituals, especially ones involving trance states or spirit journeys. The idea was that certain fermented mixtures, taken in small amounts, helped unlock visions. Whether that's spiritual power or a mild case of berry-induced food poisoning is still up for scholarly debate. Later that day, you return to the longhouse, your basket heavy and your legs soaked up to the knees. They're preparing a sweet stew. Yes, stew, that includes dried berries, old apples, a few turnip chunks, and a splash of birch syrup. It's thick, tart, and surprisingly complex. You dip in your wooden spoon and let the warmth flood your mouth. One of the younger kids adds dried rowan berries to her bowl, grinning as you taste it. Bitter, like pure aspirin. You try not to make a face. Good for your blood, she says. Grandma said it keeps the bad spirits out. You're not sure about the spirits, but you now understand why Vikings were always so angry. Half their meals fought back. Around the fire, an elder recites a story about the goddess Idun and her magical apples that kept the gods young. Some scholars believe those apples might have actually been berries, or any precious fruit. In a world where sweet things were rare and fleeting, berries were sacred. Preserved, guarded, honoured. In some households, the first berries picked each season were offered to the household spirits, buried near doorposts or hearths. There's another curious detail that catches your attention. Archaeologists have found berry seeds in ancient Norse toilets. Yep, latrine science. Which means not only did they eat these berries, they ate them often, and in large quantities. The seeds, still intact, tell us what wild fruits made up the Viking diet. Cloudberries, lingonberries, sloe, elderberry, rose hips, forest candy, served in leather bags and wooden bowls. You spend the evening watching a drying rack filled with berries slowly dehydrate over the hearth. The air smells tart and sweet. These will be packed away for the winter, mixed into barley cakes, steeped in tea, or rehydrated in stews. Not one will be wasted. And it hits you again. This isn't just food. It's strategy. It's timing. You have a short window to gather what the forest offers, and once it's gone, it's gone. Every berry is a vitamin, a calorie, a possible cure, or a poison if you get cocky. As you settle into your spot by the fire, a bowl of warm berry stew in your hands, the room glows with a faint pink-orange hue from the flames and the last light outside. You think about that moment earlier, finding that lone cluster of cloudberries under the moss, bright and glowing like little suns, a tiny burst of sweetness in a world built on salt and smoke. That's what berries were for the Vikings. Not just nutrition, but relief. A taste of warmth in a cold place. Something that made the grinding, chewing and bone-picking days feel just a little more human. And right now, spoon in hand, legs stretched out, belly full of warm forest jam, you feel human too. By now you've tasted root slurries, chewy bark, sea sponge snacks, and vaguely sweet berry sludge. But today, you're heading to the shore again. This time, not for fish, but for something that clings to the rocks and smells like low tide's breath. Seaweed. You heard right. Vikings didn't just sail over the sea, they ate it. You trudge through the briny wind, boots squishing through kelp-strewn sand, following a few villagers who carry woven baskets and sharpened sticks. The tide is low, revealing a glossy carpet of slippery green, brown and crimson. It's alien-looking, tentacle plants. The kind of stuff you'd expect to find in a sci-fi soup on Mars. But to the Vikings, this was a salad bar. A squishy, slightly terrifying salad bar. First up is dulse. It's a red-purple seaweed with a leathery texture and the look of something you shouldn't eat. But you tear off a piece and chew anyway. It's salty, chewy, a little smoky if you imagine hard enough. Packed with iron and iodine, it was a survival snack, eaten fresh, dried, or even ground into powder and mixed with flour. Think of it like Viking seasoning, umami with a side of ocean funk. Nearby, a boy hacks at bladderwrack, a brown seaweed with bulbous air sacs that pop when you squeeze them. You do it. Because of course you do. The pop is satisfying, the smell less so. But bladderwrack was harvested not just for food, but for its medicinal uses. Boiled into broth, it helped with digestion and sore throats. Some even say it soothed aching joints, though modern scientists might roll their eyes. You join a group picking up long strands of sugar kelp, which tastes like it sounds, slightly sweet, with a mineral tang and a finish that makes you want to lick your teeth. This one's a multitasker, boiled in soup, sun-dried for travel, or wrapped around fish before roasting over the fire. You try a bite straight from the strand, and it's like biting into a salted rubber band. But hey, it's chewable. That's already ahead of some of the bark bread you've eaten. Back in the village, they're making a dish you've never seen before, a kind of stew that starts with seaweed, then adds root vegetables, dried fish flakes and barley mush. It simmers low and long over the fire, thickening into something between chowder and algae smoothie. The colour is questionable, the smell, comforting if you're into ocean breeze and onion sweat. You dip your horn spoon in and taste. It's not bad, it's rich, deeply savoury. The seaweed gives it body and salt, the roots bring sweetness, and the barley adds a porridge-like bulk. This is food you eat when winter is clawing at your bones and your soul needs something warm and weird. Here's the thing, seaweed was everywhere, and it wasn't just for humans. Livestock ate it too. Sheep grazed on kelp-rich shores, especially in Iceland, where grass could be a seasonal myth. Some modern scholars even argue that the high mineral content of seaweed-fed animals gave Viking meat a distinct flavour. Imagine a leg of lamb with subtle hints of saltwater and iron. Sounds fancy now. Back then it was just practical. And seaweed had another trick: preservation. Vikings used it to wrap fish, meat, or even cheese before burying it underground. The salt and moisture helped keep things from rotting too quickly. Not the same as refrigeration, but close enough. Your ancestors were basically nature's Tupperware inventors. But not all seaweed was safe. Some species caused stomach issues, especially in large amounts. Others were so tough they'd rip up your guts if eaten raw. Vikings knew which to avoid, but there were always accidents. There's mention in sagas of bad harvest from the sea, a phrase many believe refers to spoiled or misidentified seaweed. Which, yeah, one wrong mouthful of rotting kelp and your next stop is the afterlife. There's some archaeological curiosity around this too. Seaweed doesn't preserve well, but coastal dig sites have turned up drying racks and large clay vessels with traces of marine plant residue. That suggests it was not only consumed, but stored. Dried seaweed, rehydrated in stews or mashed into cakes, might have been a travel staple for seafarers crossing open water for weeks at a time. It's light, nutrient-dense and immune to Viking mould levels. A miracle, really. As the afternoon winds pick up, you're invited to help prepare a seaweed cake. The term cake is generous. It's more of a squashed baked patty made from seaweed pulp, crushed oats, and a hint of wild garlic. These are formed by hand, pressed onto flat stones, and roasted by the fire until the edges curl. You try one hot. It crackles, bends, and tastes like the sea tried its hand at baking. Strange, but edible. You'd eat 3 more if no one were looking. Later, they bring out seaweed ale. That's right. Someone, somewhere, thought, let's ferment ocean plants and see what happens. You sip. It's brackish. It's bitter. It's possibly alive. And yet, it's not the worst thing you've put in your mouth this week. Apparently, it's known for giving people strong dreams. You make a mental note to sleep on your side tonight, just in case. By nightfall, the sky turns lavender grey, and you sit with a small group around the hearth, seaweed stew still warm in your gut. You're sticky with salt. Your boots smell like an abandoned dock, and your breath could probably scare away wolves. But you're full, and warm, and not entirely miserable. The wind picks up and carries the scent of the sea through the village. It smells like food now. You think back to that first taste of dulse, rubbery and strange, but somehow exactly right for this place. That's Viking cuisine in a nutshell. It doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always taste good, but it's honest. It's from the earth and the sea, dug up, dried out, chewed on, and made into something that could carry a person through winter. And somehow, despite everything, you want seconds. This morning, someone hands you a bowl of warm, dark mush and says, "Eat quick before it congeals." Not exactly the most appetizing advice, but you've learned by now not to question it. You peer into the bowl. It's thick, glossy, smells a little metallic. The colour? Let's just say if vampires had oatmeal, this would be it. Blood pudding. You'd heard rumours. Whispers of Vikings using every part of the animal. Nothing wasted. But this is commitment. And apparently, breakfast. You take a cautious bite. It's smooth, almost creamy, with a texture of soft sausage and a taste that walks a fine line between iron and salt. They've mixed it with grain, probably barley, and maybe a little wild onion. There's even a bit of dried apple in yours, which you silently thank the gods for. The woman across from you grins. That one's fresh. Killed the pig yesterday. You nod slowly, trying not to visualize it. This is blood cuisine, a genre all its own in the Viking world. Blood sausages, blood pancakes, blood porridge, and yes, even blood drinks. In times of scarcity, which, let's be honest, was most of the time, fresh blood wasn't just a byproduct, it was nutrition. A dense, iron-rich ingredient that could be salted, boiled, fried, or poured straight into soups. Outside, a young boy is helping clean out a wooden trough-stained deep burgundy. They've just finished making a batch of blodmør, blood sausage. He's scooping up bits of leftover filling to feed the dogs, who are very into it. You get a look at the sausage links hanging from a rack. They're lumpy and dark, tied off with stringy sinew, and they swing slightly in the cold breeze like some kind of edible wind chime. Inside the longhouse, preparations continue. A woman named Freydis is stirring a pot over a low flame. "Blood pancakes today," she says, "best with sour cream." You're sceptical, but she ladles a portion onto a flat iron pan. The mix is just blood, barley flour, and a bit of milk. As it cooks, it firms up into a thick, dense flapjack that smells, honestly, not terrible. You try it once it's cooled, topped with a dollop of soured milk. It's rich, savoury, and almost chocolatey in its depth. Weird, yes, but not the worst thing you've put in your mouth lately. In fact, you finish it, voluntarily. Turns out blood dishes weren't just for the desperate. They were regular fare, particularly after a slaughter, and during seasonal festivals where animals were killed in groups to preserve meat for winter. The fresh blood was immediately put to use, mixed with grains, herbs, and anything remotely edible. The kind of nose-to-tail cuisine that modern chefs love to brag about, but the Vikings were doing it before it was cool, or sanitary. Now, here's the odd bit. In some Norse rituals, blood wasn't just food, it was sacred. Sacrificial blood, hlort, was collected in special bowls and used to anoint idols, walls, even people. Think of it as spiritual seasoning. There's evidence from saga literature describing these ceremonies, but historians still argue over how widespread they were. Some think the sagas exaggerate, others believe it was central to Norse religious life. There's also debate around whether blood drinks existed outside of ritual. Some translations mention warriors consuming raw blood for strength or after battle. Others suggest these were symbolic references, or misinterpretations of medicinal brews. Either way, you're not being offered any warm blood wine today, thankfully. Midday, you're invited to help prepare slatur, a kind of mixed meat and blood sausage. You watch as they stuff a mash of liver, oats, fat and blood into a clean sheep's stomach, then boil the whole mess for hours. The smell is intense, meaty, metallic, and strangely sweet. When it's done, you're offered a slice. It's dense, dark, and spongy. The flavour? Surprisingly balanced. The liver gives it depth, the fat gives it richness, and the grains hold it together. This was Viking power food, packed with calories and easy to preserve. Once cooled, it could be sliced, fried, or just eaten cold on the road. As the afternoon sun filters through the smoke hole, you sit with a bowl of something called blodgrot. That's blood porridge to you. Mixed with sour milk and barley, it's thick enough to eat, with a knife and about as cheery looking as a murder scene. But you're hungry, and okay, it's not terrible, you've adjusted. A girl nearby is carving runes into a bone knife. She glances over. You like it? You nod, mouthful of iron-laced porridge. She smiles. My grandmother said it made her strong enough to carry 3 buckets of water at once. There's a pride here, a sense that blood foods are more than just leftovers. They're fuel, culture, a reminder that survival isn't always pretty, but it can be resourceful, and even delicious if you squint. And here's a quirky fringe fact. Some folklore claims certain Viking warriors drank blood before battle. Not their enemies, but their own livestocks. Cow or sheep blood taken fresh was believed to fortify the body and steady the spirit. Maybe it worked. Or maybe it was just iron and protein hitting the bloodstream like a meaty espresso. By nightfall, the longhouse smells like charred meat and salted blood sausage. Your belly is full in that heavy, mineral-rich way. You've eaten dishes you can't even pronounce, and might not admit to in polite company. But your energy is high, your mind sharp, and your appreciation for Viking food culture? Through the roof. They didn't waste. They didn't flinch. They took every part of the animal and turned it into fuel, ritual and heritage, even the blood. And as you stretch out on a bed of straw, blood sausage still warming your stomach, you think, yeah, maybe not every day, but for today, it worked. You wake to a low humming sound, something between a chant and a wheeze. Turns out it's the morning dairy churn, which frankly sounds more like an exorcism than food prep. Outside the longhouse, 2 women are rocking a wooden churn barrel back and forth, rhythmically sloshing fermented milk into butter, while a third scrapes something thick and sour out of a stone bowl. You step closer. The smell hits like a sour punch to the face. Tangy, sharp, and vaguely yeasty. This, you're told, is skyr. Forget modern yogurt. Skyr in the Viking Age was a battlefield between curd and acid. It's made by culturing skimmed milk, straining out the whey, and aging the curds until they're borderline sentient. You scoop up a dollop with your finger and taste it. Wow. It's like eating a very determined cheese, sour as sin. The texture is grainy but creamy, and you immediately imagine slathering it over hot barley cakes just to calm it down. But skyr wasn't just for breakfast. It was a staple, eaten fresh, salted for storage, or mixed with berries and honey to make what might be the closest thing Vikings had to dessert. Some even use leftover whey as a drink, a cooking liquid, or, brace yourself, a hair rinse. You glance at the glistening locks of the churner and silently take notes. You're offered a bowl of soured milk next, not sour cream, just sour milk. It's thin, almost watery, with a tang like someone tried to pickle a cow. But you sip it, and again, it's surprisingly refreshing, especially after a few days of chewy blood products and salt-cured fish. This, apparently, was a daily drink. Fermented dairy was safer than raw water, easier to store, and loaded with friendly bacteria, even if those bacteria occasionally smelled like feet. Nearby, a man is draining curds into a cloth bag. He's making Viking cheese, though you wouldn't dare call it that to his face. The curds are soft and grainy, somewhere between ricotta and drywall. He salts them lightly, then packs them into wooden moulds. Later they'll be aged in the coolest corner of the longhouse, where they'll harden into crumbly wheels of survival calories. You're allowed a slice from last month's batch. It breaks apart in your fingers and smells like someone left a yogurt cup on a windowsill for 2 weeks. You pop it in your mouth. It's aggressive, sharp, salty, but also kind of addictive. It grabs the sides of your tongue and doesn't let go. You imagine it melting slightly over hot flatbread and suddenly feel very okay with Viking dairy logic. One woman points to a large clay vessel buried halfway in the ground. Inside is something pale and sloshy, sealed with a plug of moss. She removes the cap and stirs. You lean in and recoil. It's a pungent wave of milk gone rogue. This is surmilk, fermented longer than usual and used in stews, porridges and, wait for it, marinades. Apparently soaking meat in this sour milk made it tender and preserved it longer. You wonder who figured that out first, and how bad their kitchen smelled. And then comes the butter. Forget golden sticks in neat paper. Viking butter is raw, cultured and stored in wooden barrels or sheepskin bladders. It's dense, rich, and laced with hints of the grass and herbs the cows munched all summer. It's also salted heavily to keep from going rancid. You taste a pat on your barley cake. It melts slowly, its salt and fat cutting the edge of the sour skyr like a peace treaty. Here's a quirky twist. In Iceland, massive chunks of butter were sometimes buried in bogs and left to ferment. For years. Budasmjör, they called it. Bog butter. Archaeologists have found blobs of it over 1,000 years old. Some think it was food storage. Others believe it had ritual significance, maybe even offerings to land spirits. Either way, bog butter was very real and very funky. You get to churn some yourself, working the heavy wooden handle up and down until your arms burn. Inside, cream begins to separate into butter and buttermilk. The buttermilk is saved for baking or drinking, while the butter gets salted, moulded, and wrapped in layers of moss or birch bark for storage. Nothing goes to waste. Not a drop. There's a scholarly debate over how sophisticated Viking dairying really was. Some argue it was widespread and advanced, with long-term storage, aged cheese varieties, and export trade. Others think dairy was more seasonal and localized, with most products consumed fresh or lightly fermented. The truth is likely somewhere in between. What's clear is that dairy mattered. A lot. In law codes, fines were sometimes paid in milk or butter. That's right. Get caught stealing someone's sheep and you might have to cough up a barrel of curds. You step into the longhouse just as dinner is being served. A thick stew made from sour whey, barley and salted goat meat. It's tangy, meaty and rich, with little globs of curd floating on top like islands of dairy funk. You eat it slowly, the warmth building in your belly. The sourness has become familiar now, almost comforting. As the fire burns low and the children settle in under wool blankets, someone brings out a final treat. Fresh skyer, whipped with honey and crushed dried berries. It's thick, pink and served in horn cups. You take a bite. It's still sour, still intense, but the honey smooths it out, the berries brighten it, and suddenly it's dessert. Actual dessert. You sit back, belly full, lips tingling from fermented milk and tangy cheese, and think about the miracle that is dairy. In a world without fridges, without pasteurization, without supermarkets, the Vikings turned cow squeezings into meals, drinks, condiments, and even shampoo, sometimes all at once. And somehow, it works. You pull your blanket tighter, the smell of smoke and sour whey clinging to your clothes. The night wind hums outside. Someone snores gently, and your dreams, if they come, will likely be cheese-flavoured. You wake up groggy, your mouth coated in the lingering aftertaste of fermented milk and whatever was in that stew last night. Outside it's still dark, though a faint orange glow flickers through the cracks in the wooden wall. Someone's already up and tending the hearth. Your head is pounding softly, a dull throb behind your eyes, and your mouth feels like you chewed on an old sheepskin. You, dear friend, are experiencing the age-old Viking tradition, the mead hangover. You shuffle toward the fire where someone hands you a cup of something warm and sharp-smelling. It's cloudy, yellowish, and full of floating bits that might be onion. You take a sip. It tastes like boiled socks and bitterness. Hangover soup, the woman says with a wink. Family recipe. She wasn't joking. Onion soup made with fermented broth, wild herbs, and a healthy splash of sour whey. This was the Norse version of Gatorade. Rehydrating, bracing, and just off-putting enough to slap the fog out of your head. Vikings didn't have pharmacies, or even tea really. So when they overindulged on mead, ale, or strong herbal brews, like that bog myrtle special from 2 nights ago, they relied on folk remedies to recover. You're handed a tiny bowl of something else. Raw egg beaten into sour cream. You raise an eyebrow, but drink it. It's slippery, fatty, and tastes exactly like something you should never describe out loud. But it sits heavy in your stomach in a good way, coating whatever's left of your dignity. Another option appears. Pickled herbs, specifically pickleweed, a type of coastal plant soaked in salt brine until it develops a sharp, vinegary bite. The idea is to stimulate your body back into balance. You chew on one and instantly feel your mouth flood with saliva. Effective, horrifying, weirdly addictive. You glance around and notice others going through the same motions. One guy's chewing a wad of fresh angelica root. Another is sipping a tea made from dried juniper berries and yarrow. It smells like cleaning fluid, but apparently opens the head. You take a cautious sip and immediately sneeze 5 times in a row. Consider your head opened. The Viking hangover kit wasn't formal, but it was a thing, passed down through trial, error, and generations of ill-advised drinking. They knew which roots would calm the belly, which broths would clear the mind, and which herbs might induce enough sweating to flush out the demons. Whether it worked depends on how much mead you had, and how long ago someone cleaned that fermentation barrel. You're invited to help make a new batch of the cure-all broth. It starts with leftover meat bones, sour whey, dried herbs, mostly nettle and yarrow, wild onion bulbs, and fermented turnip. Yes, fermented, because apparently Vikings thought sour plus sour equals salvation. The broth simmers for hours, becoming thick and cloudy, with a smell that's part umami, part caution sign. It's served in horn cups, sipped slowly, and chased with a piece of barley flatbread soaked in brine. Here's a fun, and slightly bizarre detail. Some texts suggest Vikings believed in balancing the humours of the body, similar to medieval medical theory. Too much heat, eat cooling herbs, too much moisture, chew dry bark or bitter roots. Whether this was pseudo-scientific understanding or just pattern recognition, it meant hangover remedies were designed to restore equilibrium, even if that meant snorting vinegar or chewing dried moss. Speaking of moss, there's another treatment. You're handed a small cube of dried reindeer moss soaked in birch sap. It's chewy, sweet, and oddly comforting. Apparently it absorbs toxins, or at least gives your body something to focus on besides the pounding in your temples. As midday rolls in, the fire is stoked and food begins to reappear. No more eggs in sour cream, thankfully. Now it's roasted onions, warmed porridge, and a stew made with last week's salted lamb. A splash of skyer stirred in adds sourness, but your stomach accepts it with grace. You chew slowly, aware of every bite. Hangover eating is sacred. You don't rush it. You worship each spoonful. You're told of one more remedy, possibly apocryphal, used by warriors who overindulge before battle. Snow. Just plain snow. Eat enough of it, the story goes, and your body shocks itself back into clarity. No one's trying it. Today, but it's still early. Outside, the air smells sharp and clean, and you're starting to feel human again. Maybe it was the soup, maybe it was the moss cube, maybe your liver just gave up on resisting. Either way, you're upright, conscious, and only mildly queasy. Some scholars argue that Viking hangovers were actually rare, pointing to the relatively low alcohol content of ancient brews. Others suggest the opposite, that due to unregulated fermentation, some batches could be dangerously strong. The sagas occasionally reference drunken brawls, hallucinations, and next morning regret. So clearly, someone was getting blitzed. But unlike modern binge culture, Viking drinking was often ritualized, part of feasts, negotiations, sacrifices, or commemorations. You didn't just get hammered because it was Friday. You got hammered because your cousin died gloriously, and you needed to shout about it. Back in the Longhouse, someone begins singing a low, croaky tune about the god Thor challenging a giant to a drinking contest. The mead horn was so massive it connected to the sea, and Thor nearly drank the ocean dry. It's a metaphor, or a warning. Either way, the lesson is clear. Even gods wake up with a sore head. You smile, wrap your cloak tighter, and take one last sip of onion broth. The hangover's fading. The nausea's turned into a kind of calm, floaty fatigue. You're full, slightly pickled, and surprisingly satisfied. And next time someone offers you a second horn of bog ale, you might just say no. Probably not. But maybe. It's a bitter morning, the kind that stiffens your fingers before you've even touched cold water. The snow has crusted into sharp ridges overnight, and the skies are flat, colourless grey, like someone forgot to finish painting it. Today is the kind of day where food is less about taste and more about simply staying alive. And what's for breakfast? Bark. You didn't mishear. When the stores run low and the animals are thin, and the last of the dried fish has gone to feed the children, the Vikings turn to something more desperate. Bark bread and lichen stew. You step outside, boots crunching on snow, and follow a grim-faced elder into the forest with a dull blade in hand and a satchel slung over your back. You're about to harvest a tree. She stops at a pine with a wide trunk, weather-worn and knotted. "This one's good," she says. You watch as she carefully scrapes the outer bark away, exposing the layer beneath, the cambium. It's soft, pale, and slightly damp. This is the edible part. Technically. You peel long strips from the trunk, stacking them like leathery lasagna noodles. They'll dry near the fire, then be ground into flour or boiled or toasted into strange chewy crisps. You chew on a raw strip because you're curious. It's slightly sweet but also bitter, fibrous, and somehow tastes like disappointment. But it's food. Sort of. Back in the Longhouse, a group is already preparing. The next masterpiece. Roasted lichen. Not a cute sprinkle on your yogurt kind of lichen. This is crusty stuff pulled from boulders, soaked in several changes of water, then boiled to remove the bitterness and acid. You help stir a pot that smells like wet dirt and desperation. The result? A slimy, gelatinous slop. It's bland, and the texture is questionable, but it fills your stomach like concrete, and that's the goal. This is famine food, scarcity cuisine, the kind of stuff that doesn't get remembered in stories unless it's to say, we were hungry enough to eat bark, and yet there's method to the misery. Bark bread isn't just bark, it's blended with barley or oat flour when available, and occasionally leavened with sour whey. The pine cambium adds carbs and a slightly sweet flavour. When toasted, it almost smells like molasses. Almost. You help bake small discs on a hot stone, flipping them with a wooden spatula. They darken at the edges, puff a little, and you bite into one. Chewy, dense, but edible, and with a smear of bog butter, strangely satisfying. Lichen stew is ladled into wooden bowls, steaming thick and greenish-grey. It's been flavoured with dried onion, seaweed, and one lonely turnip cube floating like a life raft. You eat slowly, grateful for the heat, grateful it's not just boiled shoe leather. Again. You hear a story about a winter long ago when the snow never stopped falling and the entire village survived for a month on tree bark and boiled reindeer hide. The reindeer part was chewy, but the bark, that was the real delicacy. One elder recalls a recipe where birch cambium was roasted until it crisped like bacon. You laugh. They're serious. You get a sample. It's crunchy and vaguely sweet. A bark chip. You nod like it's delicious, because they're proud. There's even a fringe theory that some Vikings used tree moss mixed with fat as emergency rations. Boiled down, pressed into cakes, and dried until shelf-stable. No one offers you one. You're both relieved and a little disappointed. One woman pulls out a clay pot sealed with dried leather. Inside is a dried, cracked lump that used to be soup. Lichen and marrow paste, she says, from last spring. She chips off a piece, adds it to boiling water, and stirs until it reconstitutes into something that might once have met your great-grandfather's definition of stew. You try it. It tastes like freezer burn and memories. But here's the part that gets you. No one complains. These people have memories of hunger. Real hunger. Not the skipped lunch kind, but the gnawing, days-long emptiness where a strip of boiled bark feels like a gift from the gods. So they talk about lichen stew with reverence. Bark bread with nostalgia. These foods, forgotten in modern kitchens, were lifelines. There's scholarly debate about how common these ingredients actually were. Some argue that bark and lichen were emergency-only items, used in starvation years. Others suggest they had a more regular role, especially in northern settlements with short growing seasons and long winters. The truth is probably both. When your world could freeze for 9 months straight, you learn to eat what didn't run away. You spend the afternoon collecting more lichen. The good kind, not the bitter yellow stuff that makes you see dancing wolves. That one's for rituals, allegedly. You scrape gently with a bone knife, careful not to over-harvest. Even now you can't afford to waste. Back inside, someone is pressing bark flour into small cakes and stacking them for drying. These will be travel food, durable enough to survive weeks in a satchel. Not tasty, not fun, but there when needed. You get the feeling that half of Viking cuisine was created by someone squinting at a tree and thinking, what if we just tried eating it? As night falls, a stew pot bubbles over the hearth. It's lichen again, with a bit of dried lamb and a handful of barley. You eat it quietly, staring into the fire. The wind howls outside, but you're warm, and full, and somehow grateful for the strange foods that fill the gaps between harvests. You sip some hot sour whey with a sprig of pine needles for flavour, and listen as an old man recites a poem about survival. Not conquest, not gods, but the kind of strength that comes from chewing bark and boiling moss and waking up to do it again. It's not glorious, but it's real, and here, real is enough. You're sitting in the longhouse again, chewing your way through a piece of what you think is dried goat shoulder, when a crunch stops you mid-bite. Not a good crunch, like crusty bread or toasted nuts. No, this is the kind of crunch that makes your brain whisper, that might have been a bug. You pause, hold it to the light. Yep, it was a bug. Welcome to another delightful feature of the Viking diet, unintentional protein. Or as the villagers say, protein's protein. Out here, far from the delicate kitchens of modernity, you eat what doesn't eat you first. Insects, maggots, beetles and worms. These aren't ingredients so much as inevitable companions. You can't smoke a fish or dry a slab of meat without attracting things. Tiny things, wiggly things. Extra seasoning if you like a little optimism with your nausea. Vikings didn't always set out to eat bugs, but when food needed to last and you didn't have a fridge or much firewood to spare, the line between additive and accident got blurry. Outside, a man is scraping the last of a drying rack. Fish skins, thin slices of meat, and, oh yes, a swarm of beetles scurrying away as he lifts the rack's cloth covering. He shrugs, brushes them off, and gives the meat a smell. Still good. Sort of. Maybe. He tosses it into the stew anyway. You're handed a chunk of dried cheese and notice something moving inside it. You blink. No, your eyes weren't lying. Larvae. The cheese is alive. You glance at your host. She shrugs again and bites into her own piece like it's nothing. They're clean, she says, better than biting into one that's already dead. It's oddly reassuring. Maybe. This wasn't an everyday delicacy, but it happened more often than you'd think. Flies laid eggs in meat that wasn't cured fast enough, or in cheese left just a bit too long in the wrong corner of the longhouse. And if times were hard, if winter came early or a storm wiped out the stores, you didn't throw it out. You scraped, you rinsed, you cooked it longer, and you hoped for the best. You helped stir a pot of fish stew, noticing a few tiny squirming stowaways floating on top. They'll cook down, someone says. Adds texture. And it's true. After a while you stop noticing. The heat dissolves them. They become part of the broth. You focus on the taste, which is salty and rich and not at all buggy. Back inside, an older woman pulls out a container of dried berries. Cloudberries and lingonberries preserved from summer. She pops a few into her mouth and offers you some. You take a handful, toss them in, and crunch. A beetle. Maybe two. You flinch, but she just laughs. More for your strength. There's actually some evidence that Vikings consumed insects intentionally, at least occasionally. Bark beetles, especially, were noted for their presence in flour stores, and sometimes eaten along with the bread. Not because they were tasty, they weren't, but because separating them from your flour was too much work, and they were harmless enough. Extra calories, tiny crunch. Grain bins were notorious for worm infestations. You check one later in the day and find exactly what you feared. Wriggling larvae. A younger boy grins and stirs the top layer like he's cooking stew. Just take from the top, he says. Bottom's theirs now. You help scoop the clean flour, which still has more texture than you'd like, and add it to a batch of barley flatbread. When it's cooked over the fire, you swear you can still hear it hiss a little. Or maybe that's your brain begging for toast. There's a quirky little dish they offer you called worm mash, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like. A forager found a rotted log full of fat white larvae, cooked them in fat, mashed them with acorn flour and salt, and served it warm. You hesitate. They're squirmy no longer. The texture is like scrambled eggs crossed with mashed potato. The flavour? Nutty, buttery, a little earthy, not horrible, not exactly repeatable, but you finish the bowl, and here's where things get really weird. Some healers claimed certain insects had medicinal uses. Crushed ants for fever, beetle shells ground into paste for toothaches. Maggoty meat, if cleaned properly, was even said to heal wounds, though most of that might be luck and desperation. There's scholarly disagreement, of course. Some researchers think these stories are exaggerated, that bugs were eaten mostly by accident, not by choice. Others believe entomophagy, eating insects, was a small but accepted part of the Viking food landscape, especially during food shortages. The truth is hard to pin down. Archaeological evidence is, understandably, squishy. But even today, in parts of rural Scandinavia, stories persist of worm cheese, of beetle-seasoned flour, of spider broth for courage. Real or not, they reflect a people who didn't waste a thing. You sit by the fire later, biting into a flatbread that's been toasted crisp and dipped in sour whey. It tastes clean, simple, you relax, until you feel something crunch, very faintly. You tell yourself it's barley, just barley. A woman beside you offers a clay cup of berry juice, floating in it. 2 tiny gnats. You drink it anyway. You've stopped caring, and honestly, you feel stronger, hungrier, more grounded, like something primal woke up inside you and said, "We're eating this. Don't ask what it is," because that was Viking life. You couldn't afford to be picky. Bugs happened, worms wriggled, but people lived through winters on worse, and when your body needed fuel, even the smallest creature was part of the feast. You lie back under your fur blanket, eyes heavy, belly full of mystery protein, and wonder if the beetle in your cheese will visit you in your dreams. Probably. You're crouched at the edge of a shallow fjord now, the cold seeping through your knees and into your bones. The tide has gone out, and what's left behind is a wet, shining wonderland of slick rocks, scattered shells, and patches of glistening seaweed. You've been handed a net, a clay jug, and some instructions that were mostly hand gestures. Today you're helping prepare one of the more primal Viking meals, clay-cooked shellfish, and what the villagers affectionately call mud meals. Sounds promising. You start by collecting mussels and limpets, prying them off rocks with a carved bone spatula. Some resist, others pop off with a satisfying plunk. You scoop them into your net bag, trying not to slip into a tide pool along the way. Beside you, a boy jabs a stick into the sand and comes up with a wriggling, furious crab. Too small, he says, tossing it back like a judge on a Viking cooking show. Once you've gathered enough, you help carry the bounty back to the village. You're expecting a fire and a pot. What you get instead is a pit. They've dug a shallow hole in the earth, lined it with stones, and built a fire directly on top. Once the rocks are glowing red and the coals have settled, the fire is cleared away, and a layer of wet seaweed is thrown in, hissing and steaming like it's trying to argue. Then go the shellfish, mussels, clams, and even a couple of strange snails. Over that, another layer of seaweed, then mud, actual mud. Thick, wet, sticky clay mud, scooped from the riverside and patted into place like frosting. You stare. They smile. Wait, someone says, and so you do. The pit bakes quietly for nearly 2 hours. The mud hardens into a crust. The seaweed steams, the shells pop open, and everything inside starts to transform. It's not pretty, but it's cooking. Real cooking, Viking style. And it works. Once the mud has cooled enough to crack apart, the villagers start breaking it open with sticks and flat stones. Inside, the shellfish have steamed open, their briny smell rising in gentle puffs of sea-soaked air. You pick out a mussel, still warm, and pry it free with your fingers. It's soft, salty, and tastes like the ocean after a storm. You try a limpet, chewier, earthier, a bit like mushroom-flavoured rubber. Not amazing, but edible. Then someone hands you a bundle of something wrapped in more clay. Trout, they say. You hold it up, confused, as they motion for you to crack it like an egg. The clay shell breaks apart easily, revealing an entire small fish, scales and all, nestled inside. The flesh is steaming, delicate and perfectly moist. You dig in with your fingers, and this is where things get kind of magical. It's good. Not just good for the Viking age, but actually good. The fish is rich and clean-tasting, infused with a soft, earthy aroma from the clay and seaweed. No seasoning, no oil, no fancy pan, just dirt, fire, and patience. This clay method wasn't just for flavour, it was survival engineering. The shell sealed in moisture and heat, cooked food evenly, and kept ash and smoke out. It was also portable. Fish could be wrapped in clay and left near a fire while people worked, returning later to a warm, ready meal. Simple, reliable, and perfect for a world where weather and war never played nice. A fringe fact you learn around the fire later. In some coastal areas, Vikings used this same method with seabirds. Whole gulls or puffins were wrapped in clay and roasted underground. The feathers? Pulled off with the hardened shell, leaving clean cooked meat inside. It was messy, it was brutal, but it worked, and no plucking required. Efficiency, Viking edition. Not everything from the pit is a hit, though. Someone pulls out a pouch of what they call mudroot. It's actually a wild tuber that grows in the swampy areas near the riverbanks. Small, knobby, and about as appealing as a wet potato. They roast it in the coals until soft, then slice it open. You try a bite. It's bitter, gritty, and leaves a strange film on your teeth. You get used to it, someone says, smiling, which is Viking code for, this used to kill people before we figured out how to cook it properly. There's scholarly debate about just how much pit cooking went on in Viking society. The physical evidence, fire pits, scorched stones, remnants of shells, is there, especially along the coasts. But because clay doesn't always preserve well, it's hard to tell if this was a widespread daily practice or just a regional survival trick. Some think it was reserved for group meals or feasts. Others argue it was a standard way to cook without dirtying the inside of a longhouse. But everyone agrees it's clever, and it makes use of what's right under your feet. As the sun dips low, the villagers gather around the fire with steaming bowls of shellfish stew. It's made with the leftovers, anything that didn't get eaten straight from the shell, along with seawater, seaweed, and a few bruised turnips. You sip it carefully, the broth salty and strangely sweet. It warms you from the inside like some ancient miso soup made by very determined people with no soybeans. Later, a quiet falls over the camp. People chew slowly, staring into the fire, shells littering the ground like cracked bones. Someone burps, a good sign, a successful meal. You find a seat on a flat stone, a full belly and clay under your nails. You smell like smoke and shellfish and maybe a little like mud, but it's oddly comforting. This wasn't food meant to impress. It was meant to work. And it did work. well enough that your stomach isn't planning a mutiny. As the coals burn low and the night rises around you, someone nudges a small piece of roasted trout your way. You smile, take a bite, and think, dirt never tasted so good. By now you've chewed on bark, slurped up fermented fish juice, and survived more edible mosses than you care to admit. You've got seaweed in your teeth and a developing fondness for clay-roasted trout. So when someone tells you today's lesson is about Viking beer, your brain lights up like it just heard there was a pizza delivery service in the year 893. But don't get too comfortable. This isn't modern beer. This is ale before hops. This is what happens when you try to get a little buzzed with nothing but herbs, smoke, and the resilience of a people who thought bog myrtle was a flavour. You follow a crooked-footed man named Erica to a small hut behind the longhouse. The smell hits you first. Earthy, sweet, a little tangy, and unmistakably alcoholic. Not the clean, crisp scent of a pilsner. More like the ghost of a wet meadow died in a barrel and came back better. Inside there's a big wooden vat filled with a dark liquid, bubbles popping lazily across the surface. Erica beams. Almost ready, he says, then hands you a horn cup. Try. You sniff. It's smoky. You sip. It's confusing. This ale isn't sharp or bitter like what you're used to. It's softer, rounder, slightly sweet. There's a whisper of roasted barley, a kick of earth, and the gentle floral punch of herbs you wouldn't normally put in a drink unless you were trying to summon a woodland spirit. Bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, maybe even wild juniper or a bit of woodruff. It's like drinking someone's backyard, but in a good way. Erica explains the basics. Grains, mostly barley, were mashed with hot water in a wooden trough lined with straw or even animal stomachs. No metal pots, no precision. The mash was heated with hot stones, dropped in, straight from the fire. No fancy thermometers, just intuition and a lot of steam. The sugars from the grain created the foundation. Then came the herbs. Hops, the bitterness you know and love, weren't widely used in Viking times. They existed in parts of Europe, sure, but the Norse weren't brewing IPAs. Instead, they turned to whatever was around. Bog myrtle added a warming bitterness and mild preservative effect. Yarrow gave the brew an astringent floral character, but too much could lead to dreams, which is how they politely say you might hallucinate or pee yourself. There's debate about just how alcoholic these ales were. Some scholars argue Viking beer was weak, just enough to make water safe and lift the spirits. Others believe that depending on the mash and fermentation time, some batches packed quite the punch, especially if you were drinking it by the bucket, which, let's be honest, they absolutely were during feasts. You're handed another mug, this one cooler, lighter in colour, and fizzing slightly. It's a small batch test brew, made with honey and birch sap. The taste is incredible, sweet, herbal, with a delicate sourness. Erica nods, proud. Spring beer, he says, made with meltwater and first herbs. You take another sip and feel a little sad that this style of beer isn't lining supermarket shelves in 2025. Yet. Then comes the part they don't tell you in tourist brochures. Ale was often thick. We're talking spoon-in-the-glass thick. Unfiltered, full of sediment, and sometimes chunky with leftover grain, or the occasional bug that fell in during fermentation. In fact, beer was so alive that it had to be drunk quickly or go bad. You try a bowl of older ale from a clay jug that's been sitting in a root cellar for a few weeks. It's sour, flat, and tastes like a damp cave. Still drinkable, but barely. Definitely emergency ale. Beer was also used in cooking. You help make a barley mush soaked in the dregs of the last batch. It's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on how sad you feel. The warmth of the alcohol softens the grains and makes them easier to digest. Add a few berries or a spoon of skyr and it almost passes for porridge. Almost. Fun historical side note, beer wasn't just a man's drink. Women brewed it. Women guarded the yeast. In some households, the matriarch was the brewkeeper, and her ability to make good ale was considered a sign of divine favour. Inheritance often included the yeast itself, scraped from the walls of the brewing trough or kept alive in batches of sourdough and amash. A legacy passed from mother to daughter, like a living, burping heirloom. There's even evidence that beer played a role in rituals. Mead was sacred, but ale was communal. Toasts were made over mugs of frothy herbal beer. Oaths were sealed. Feasts ended in staggering. Some Norse poems mention ale as a gift of the gods, particularly Aegir, the brewer of the sea. Which is fitting, because this stuff could knock you down like a wave if you weren't careful. You help bottle a new batch in pitch-sealed clay jars, then carry them down to the river to cool. A few have herbs poking out of the mouths like strange little floral grenades. You're warned not to drink the strong batch, the one with the root that looks like a screaming man, unless you have nowhere to be for the next 3 days. You nod seriously. You very much believe them. Evening falls, and with it comes a small gathering in the longhouse. People drink from the same horn, wiping it off with the same greasy rag. The ale flows, stories are told, someone sings a very aggressive love ballad about a goat. You sip slowly, the warmth spreading through your chest, the herbs settling into your bones like lullabies, and somewhere between your second and third cup, it hits you. This isn't just drinking. It's nourishment. It's ritual. It's memory, suspended in grain and herbs and smoke. You lean back, full of strange beer, and let the buzz carry you just far enough that even the bog butter starts to make sense. The next morning arrives slow and pale, like a candle trying to light a cavern. Your head hums gently, not quite a hangover, but the memory of one. You stretch under your wool blanket, your skin still clinging to the smoky smell of the longhouse, and emerge to the quiet bustle of early chores. The sun, or whatever dim cousin of it this place gets, glints faintly off the frost-tipped grass. And today, you're going hunting, for flavour. Actual flavour. Not mud, not sour milk, not bark. Today, you're exploring the Viking spice rack, and yes, it was a thing. You meet Fridis again, the same woman who introduced you to blood pancakes and once, terrifyingly, offered you a cheese with surprise. She beckons you over to a small wooden chest tucked near the hearth and covered with an old animal pelt. When she lifts it, a puff of spicy, earthy aroma drifts out. Unexpected, rich, complex. You blink. Is that garlic? Turns out, even in the Viking Age, flavour mattered. It wasn't all just boiled meat and sadness. These people used whatever they had to make food taste better, or at least more interesting. And while they didn't have cinnamon or peppercorns or that cute little herb ball you bought online, they had their own palette of punchy, strange seasonings. You start with mustard seeds, tiny pale yellow, crushed into a coarse powder and stirred into stews to add heat. You pinch some onto your tongue, it bites, not like modern mustard, more like a sharp jab in the mouth. Fridis chuckles. We put it on dried fish, makes it come back to life. Next up, wild garlic. Not the bulb kind you know, but green leaves foraged from the woods smelling somewhere between onions and revenge. Chopped and sprinkled over porridge or fish, they brightened dull dishes and supposedly kept away spirits. Or at least made you too smelly for them to approach. Then she shows you ground angelica root. Yes, the same plant you foraged days ago, but this part's been dried and grated. It smells sweet, musky, like licorice with a bad attitude. Used sparingly, it went into bread, ale, or even blood dishes to soften the iron edge. You try a pinch and instantly understand why sparingly was important. That stuff is intense. There's also juniper, those little dark berries crushed and tossed into meat stews for a citrusy, piney note. You chew one, cautiously, and it's like kissing a Christmas tree. But in context, roasted goat with juniper and garlic. Now you're thinking like a Viking. Over by the hearth, someone is preparing a roast with a rub made from salt, wild thyme, and bog rosemary. You sniff the blend. It's sharp, peppery, and carries the ghost of a forest floor. There's no chili, no black pepper, no imported spice rack with 72 glass jars. But the flavour? It's layered, thoughtful, somehow more grounded than anything you've eaten in weeks. Later you're handed a small clay jar with an unfamiliar scent. Earthy, warm, almost smoky. Burnt onion. Not an accident. Intentional. Turns out the Vikings used charred vegetables as seasoning. Burnt leeks or onions were chopped and stored, then crumbled into stews for an umami depth they didn't have a name for yet. You taste a bit of broth flavoured this way and are stunned to realise it's kind of rich, like actual soup instead of just flavoured hot water. Then there's the matter of imported spices, and here's where things get a little murky. Some Viking elites, chiefs, merchants, raiders with extra coin, had access to the exotic stuff. Caravans from the south brought rare things, coriander, cumin, dried ginger, even the occasional black peppercorn. These were rare, precious, and usually reserved for special dishes or rituals. They were also status symbols. If you had spices from the East, you didn't just have taste, you had power. Some sagas mention feasts with spiced meat and honeyed cakes, hinting at this luxurious side of Norse cooking. But for most people, these were just rumours or occasional gifts passed down through trade. Still, some scholars argue that spice use was more common than we think. Small trade ports like Hedeby and Ribe have turned up containers with spice residues. Others say it was localised, rare, and not really part of the everyday palate. Either way, the Vikings had their own native alternatives. You're offered a piece of dried venison, smoked with heather and pine needles. It smells like a campfire and the taste is resinous and slightly sweet. Piney, but good. The heather gives it a floral undercurrent that clings to your tongue. It's subtle, but somehow sophisticated. You realise Viking food wasn't bland. It just operated in a different flavour universe, one built from what you could pull out of the forest or trade across a stormy sea. Here's a quirky twist. Frida shows you a little pouch, filled with dried moss. Not for boiling this time. We burn it, she says, to flavour cheese. You raise an eyebrow. She explains that when dried moss or herbs were burned in enclosed spaces, they infused smoke into whatever hung nearby. Meat, cheese, or even butter. A primitive, effective cold smoke technique. You try a piece of the cheese later. It's crumbly, smoky, and strangely elegant. You're stunned. You didn't know cheese could taste like a forest campfire, and you like it. At dinner time, the longhouse is filled with smells that feel richer, more vibrant than before. Someone's roasted lamb ribs with juniper and wild thyme. There's a barley porridge flecked with mustard and ground angelica. Even the fermented trout, yes, it's back, has been buried with a few sprigs of charred rosemary, giving it a depth that nearly distracts from its sock-like flavour. Everyone eats with a little more enthusiasm tonight. The flavours are complex, warm, layered with the quiet confidence of people who've figured out how to make herbs taste like survival and celebration all at once. You chew your way through a roasted onion-stuffed flatbread, your lips tingling from the wild garlic, and think about all the little things they use to make food not just edible, but memorable. Even in a world without lemons or chili, without sugar or vinegar, they found ways to make food taste. You lean back on your bench, belly full, eyes heavy, and listen to the crackle of dried thyme popping in the fire. In this spice rack of moss, smoke, and wild herb chaos, you've tasted something better than comfort. You've tasted creativity. The morning fog drapes the cliffs like a worn wool blanket, and you find yourself trudging up a steep coastal path behind a line of villagers, your boots slipping in the dew. A man ahead of you carries a sack over his shoulder. Another has a long stick with a hook on the end. The wind smells sharp and salty, and the shrill cries of seabirds echo off the rocks. You're not entirely sure what you've agreed to, but you've been told it's an egg run. Sounds harmless enough, right? 15 minutes later, you're clinging to a cliff face, stomach pressed to cold stone, while someone ahead of you dangles upside down from a rope. They're reaching into a dark crevice for what looks like a very unimpressed puffin. Below you, certain death. Above you, a teenage girl casually chewing on dried fish, like this is her version of brunch. Welcome to Viking egg harvesting. They didn't raise chickens in these parts, not reliably anyway. Instead, they relied on seabirds, puffins, gulls, guillemots, and the ever-screeching kittiwakes. These birds made their nests on cliffs, and the Vikings, being the practical maniacs they were, just climbed up there and took the eggs. No big deal. You watch as the boy with the rope deposits a handful of speckled eggs into a padded basket. They're surprisingly colourful, pale, green, blue, off-white, each flecked like a little painted stone. Fresh, raw, warm from the nest. These were delicacies, rich in protein, full of fat and incredibly fragile. You wonder how many were broken on the climb down. Probably more than anyone admitted. Back in the village, the eggs are inspected and sorted. Cracked ones are cooked immediately, scrambled with sour milk and wild onions in a sizzling clay pan. You're handed a spoonful. The taste is rich, gamier than a chicken egg, with a creamy texture that coats your tongue. If you didn't know it came from something with a hooked beak and a questionable hygiene routine, you'd be impressed. Whole eggs, if they survived, were either cooked over hot stones or packed in ash and cool storage pits. Some were soaked in a mild brine made from seawater and kelp to preserve them for winter. You try one of these preserved eggs later. The white is rubbery, the yolk darkened to a creamy greenish hue. It smells faintly of smoke and seaweed and tastes surprisingly decent. A bit of sulphur, a bit of ocean, and a lot of chew. You're told that eggs weren't just food, they were offerings. Some were buried at the threshold of a new house, others left on stones for the land spirits. One old tale even claims a boy was cursed after eating the first egg of spring without thanking the gods. You make a mental note to thank every bird you see from now on. But eggs weren't the only bird-based cuisine. Oh no, today you get to try the bird itself. Down by the smokehouse, a man is carefully plucking a puffin. The bird is small, oily, and unmistakably sad-looking. Its meat, dark and lean, is salted, stuffed with herbs, and hung in the smoke for days. When it's finally deemed ready, it's roasted slowly over the fire. You get a slice. It's rich, intensely smoky, with a flavour that sits somewhere between duck and anchovy. You chew thoughtfully, nod, and commit to not asking what part of the bird it came from. There's also a bowl of boiled guillemot stew simmering nearby. Bits of meat, egg, seaweed, and wild onion bob in a cloudy broth. You're assured the feathers are gone. You sip. It's potent, salty, a little fishy in a this animal eats fish and now you're eating it kind of way. Not elegant, but hearty. And here comes the fringe delicacy, eggs buried in soot. You're shown a pit behind the longhouse where eggs are gently placed in warm ash and left to age for several days. The heat slowly cooks them, the soot flavours the shell, and the result is a smoky, semi-cooked egg, with a jammy yolk and a deep, earthy flavour. You crack one open. The whites are firm but darkened, the yolk gooey and rich. It tastes like breakfast had a secret affair with a bonfire. Scholars debate how extensive seabird cuisine was in the Viking world. Some archaeological sites show massive middens, trash heaps, full of bird bones and eggshells, especially in Iceland and parts of northern Scotland. Other sites show almost none, suggesting it was seasonal or localised. Either way, what's clear is that seabirds were essential where livestock couldn't thrive. Not just meat, but eggs, feathers, fat, and even oil. You hear tales of raiding parties taking bird oil in clay jars, used for cooking, lighting lamps, even waterproofing clothes. Nothing was wasted. Puffin fat was rendered and smeared over cloaks to keep the rain out. Gull feathers stuffed into bedding, kittiwake bones turned into needles. Vikings didn't just eat the bird, they used the bird. By evening, the longhouse smells of roast puffin, sour onion, and smoke. There's a bowl of warm barley mash topped with a poached seabird egg, yolk running like melted gold into the grain. You take a bite. It's rich, satisfying, and you can almost forget you were clinging to a cliffside 10 hours ago. As the fire dims and the last bowl is scraped clean, someone tells a story of a god who laid an egg the size of the sun. That's how the world began, they say, eyes twinkling, and that's why we climb cliffs, to get a little piece of the god's breakfast. You lie back, full of smoky bird and seaside eggs, and wonder what tomorrow will taste like. Hopefully not feathers, but you're not betting on it. You're getting used to surprises. By now, nothing shocks you. Not the clay-wrapped fish, not the blood porridge, not even the worms that came with your barley cake like sprinkles from a nightmare. But tonight's dinner, yeah, this one might just shake you. It starts with a sheep, or rather, what's left of one. You walk into the clearing behind the longhouse to find a cauldron suspended over a fire, bubbling gently. The smell hits you first, thick, fatty, and meaty, but also, faintly, unsettling, like something that used to be in your biology textbook. A boy stirs the pot with a stick, humming to himself. Beside him, on a wooden tray, sits the unmistakable shape of a sheep's head, split down the middle, cleaned, tongue hanging limp like it gave up halfway through, telling a story. It's dinner. They call it svid, boiled sheep's head, a traditional Icelandic dish that likely traces its roots straight back to the Viking era. Nothing wasted, no apology offered. You're told it's a special occasion dish. Winter meat, someone says. Good for when you've already eaten the good parts and still need to eat. The preparation isn't simple. The head is singed to remove the hair, scrubbed clean, sawed in half, and then boiled for hours with a touch of salt and maybe a few wild onions if you're lucky. You watch as it simmers, bubbles rising lazily to the surface, carrying with them the haunting scent of ancient practicality. A woman plucks it from the pot with a pair of wooden tongs. It steams. She sets it on a wooden board and begins separating it, gently, methodically. The cheeks go first, rich and tender, followed by the tongue, plump and pale, and then, oh yes, the eyes, gelatinous, gleaming. One of them bursts slightly when she pokes it. You fight the urge to leave your own body. The cheeks are passed around first. You get a slice. It's rich, fatty, and incredibly soft. Melts in your mouth like butter, but denser, more primal. You try not to think about what part of the animal used to twitch with this very muscle. You succeed, barely. Then the tongue. It's sliced thin, served cold and surprisingly mild. There's no aggressive flavour, just a silky, meaty tenderness with a slight spring. You're told it was considered a delicacy, and after one bite, you get it. It's chewy, but rewarding. A quiet bite of respect for a creature that, hours ago, still had a jawline. Then come the eyes. You hesitate. Everyone's watching. A young boy pops one into his mouth and grins like he just got the first cookie from the jar. No pressure. You pick up the remaining orb with your fingers. It wobbles. The texture is somewhere between jelly and regret. You close your eyes and take a bite. It bursts with warm liquid and a meaty centre that refuses to be categorised. Not bad, just emotional. And here's the thing. None of this is presented as weird. There's no showmanship, no novelty, just food. Efficient, humble food. The kind that stretches a winter slaughter through the coldest months. Tongue, cheeks, eyes, brain. Everything's eaten. Everything's honoured. You try a spoonful of broth next. It's fatty, deeply savoury, with a layer of sheen so thick you could skate across it. Floating inside are chunks of root vegetables. Turnip, wild carrot, maybe even a stray piece of dried mushroom. The flavour is comforting in the way only a well-simmered pot can be, but with a background hum of you just licked a skull. There's a side dish too, mashed oats mixed with drippings from the head broth. It's thick, porridge-like, with the kind of stick-to-your-rib satisfaction that makes you forgive the occasional gristle. You scoop it up with a flatbread, soak up the juices, and forget for a moment where the meat came from. Later, someone roasts the remaining skull pieces over open flame. The outer surface chars slightly, crisping up the little bits of flesh still clinging to bone. This part's for picking. You join in, snapping off a bit of cartilage here, a shred of roasted brain there. It's oddly intimate, like archaeology, but tastier. And speaking of brains, yes, they eat those too. Steamed in the skull until soft, then scooped out and mashed with herbs. The texture, creamy like pâté, but with a faint minerality that reminds you you're eating something that once thought about eating grass. Spread on toasted barley cakes, it's a bold experience. Quirky fact. Viking laws sometimes treated heads as proof of a kill. Bring back the head, and you got your bounty. Cook it, and you still proved your point. Plus, you had dinner. Some say warriors would roast enemy heads as a warning. Others say that's saga exaggeration. Either way, you glance at the fire, skull glowing red in the coals, and try not to imagine a darker version of tonight's menu. There's scholarly debate about how widespread this practice was. Some argue that sheep's head was a regional custom, particularly in Iceland and Faroe communities. Others suggest it was common across all Norse cultures, simply undocumented due to the perishable nature of the dish. After all, boiled skulls don't fossilise well. But folklore and oral tradition point to a long proud history of eating every edible part of an animal, including the parts modern folks try hard to forget were ever attached to a face. By the time dinner ends, you're full, truly full, for the first time in days. It's not the quantity, it's the quality, the richness, the depth of flavour that only comes from long cooking, slow chewing, and let's be honest, a little bravery. You sit back on a log, tongue still tingling from the tongue, lips sticky with broth, and watch the skulls blacken in the fire. Someone tells a story about a sheep that dreamed of being a deer, only to end up in the stew anyway. Everyone laughs. It's a joke, but also a lesson. Out here, meat is memory. Bones are a meal, and dinner often looks back at you. You wake up to the smell of smoke, not the cosy, comforting kind that whispers, breakfast is coming, but the dense, eye-watering kind that suggests something might be on fire, or worse, curing. The air in the longhouse is thick with it. You rub your eyes, stumble outside, and there it is, the smokehouse. A squat wooden shack just uphill, belching out plumes of grey like it's trying to communicate with the gods. Today, you're learning how Vikings made meat last. And spoiler alert, it wasn't always pretty. You follow the smell and the sounds, wood creaking, fire crackling, a few hacking coughs, to find 3 villagers stringing up meat slabs in the smokehouse, like decorations at a very carnivorous festival. Thin cuts of lamb, goat, and maybe something more mysterious hang from wooden beams, slowly turning a dark, leathery brown. Some pieces look fresh, others look like they've been here since the last ice age. You ask what the oldest one is. Autumn kill, someone answers. It's spring now. You nod slowly and pretend that's normal. This is where the magic, or let's be honest, the rot, happens. Vikings didn't have refrigerators, and salting meat required, well, salt, which wasn't cheap. So they got creative, they smoked it, dried it, hung it in the open air until the wind and cold turned it into something tough, chewy, and miraculously edible. Sometimes they buried it. Other times they just left it to ferment. Today, you're tasting meat that's been air-dried for months. The man slicing it calls it skerpikjut, a method still used in the Faroe Islands today, and possibly a descendant of older Norse practices. It's made by hanging lamb in an open-air shed, exposed to the wind, weather, and all the unpredictable glory of nature. There's no fire, no salt, just time. The result? A thin, dry meat with a powerful aroma, strong enough to make your eyes water and your stomach clench. You take a bite. It's tough, chewy. Your jaw has regrets. The flavour hits hard, gamey, salty, somehow, and intensely funky. Like meat that's been aged, then aged some more, then put through an existential crisis. And yet, it grows on you. It's sharp, tangy, almost cheesy in its fermentation. It's not bad, it's not good exactly, but your body recognises it as fuel. Dense, nutrient-packed fuel. Another villager offers you something smoked. Goat ribs this time, cooked slowly over a dung-fueled fire. Yep, dung. Dried animal droppings were a reliable fuel source in places with limited wood. The smoke was cooler, slower burning, and filled with pungent flavour compounds. You take a bite of the rib, and the flavour is unlike anything else. Smoky, rich, slightly bitter, and with a haunting aroma you can't quite place. It's not dungy. Not really. But you definitely feel like you're eating something ancient, possibly haunted. Then comes the fermented fish. They unwrap a cloth bundle from a pit behind the smokehouse. The smell escapes before the cloth does. It hits you square in the face like a rotting sea breeze wrapped in vinegar. This is rakfisk or something like it. A dish made by gutting freshwater fish, salting it lightly, then letting it ferment underground for weeks. Or months. Sometimes longer. There's no cooking, no drying. Just biology doing what it does best when left alone with fish guts. You're offered a piece on a slab of flatbread. The texture is soft, almost slimy. The taste? It's like if a fish and a blue cheese had a very passionate but ill-advised relationship. Sharp, acidic, powerful. You chew slowly, eyes watering, and realise that somehow this is intentional. This is dinner. And here's the truth. The line between preservation and rot was thin, delicate. A gamble, really. But the Vikings played it every winter. They had no choice. These techniques, fermentation, drying, smoking, weren't about flavour first. They were about survival. Flavour was a side effect. A funky, a sometimes horrifying side effect. There's a scholarly split about just how widespread fermentation was. Some argue it was limited to coastal and northern communities, where cold temps could keep rot at bay. Others say it was a regular part of the food calendar, just less glamorous than the feasting halls of the sagas. After all, nobody sings a heroic poem about the guy who nailed the goat jerky. But maybe they should. A quirky tidbit. Some meat was smoked with particular woods, or herbs believed to ward off illness, or spirits. Juniper, heather, even peat were tossed into the fire for flavour and protection. You try a slice of lamb smoked with peat and wild thyme. It tastes like a forest, a fireplace, and a hint of Viking anxiety. You like it. Later you help string up a fresh kill, rabbit or something close to it. You watch as the smoke rises around the meat, curling into the muscle, wrapping it in flavour and preservation. It'll hang here for weeks, maybe months. And when everything else runs out, someone will pull it down, slice it, and eat it with gratitude. Dinner that night is a stew made from smoked ribs, fermented root vegetables, and broth thickened with barley mush. It's smoky, rich, and has just enough sourness to make you raise an eyebrow. But it fills you, warms you, anchors you in the realness of this life. As you chew through the last piece of slightly spongy, possibly fermented goat, you realise something important. Vikings didn't fear funk. They respected it. They leaned into it. Because funk meant time. Funk meant survival. Funk meant that someone thought ahead, salted the meat, lit the fire, and made sure the food outlived the frost. You lie down that night, full of ancient meat and wood smoke, your breath probably capable of scaring off wolves, but your belly's warm, and so is your respect, for the flavours that weren't just strange but essential. Morning in the Viking world doesn't start with a gentle sunrise or a pot of coffee. It starts with someone tripping over a goat. You open your eyes to the sound of clattering hooves and muffled swearing, then the unmistakable smell of smoke and sour grain. Breakfast is underway, and it smells like beer. Again. You pull on your cloak and stumble to the fire where a large pot is already steaming. The smell hits your nose like a bread factory met a brewery in a swamp. You peer inside and find a bubbling brownish mash thick with grain, froth, and the occasional floating chunk of dried turnip. Beer mush, someone announces, ladling it into a wooden bowl. Best when it's still warm. You sit down with your serving, the consistency somewhere between porridge and wet compost, and take a bite. It's tangy, a little sweet, a little sour. The grains are soft but still chewy, and you catch a faint fizz on your tongue. That's not a mistake. This stuff is lightly fermented. It's the Viking version of breakfast beer. Technically, it's not alcoholic enough to make you wobble, unless you drink a whole bucket. But it has a gentle, mellow buzz to it. Enough to warm you, sharpen your senses, and make chewing on wet grain seem like a fine way to start your day. And it wasn't just a novelty. Beer mash was an essential part of Viking cuisine, especially when there wasn't much else to work with. When ale was brewed, which it often was, it left behind thick grain mash, rich in nutrients. The Vikings weren't about to throw that out. They repurposed it into food. Sometimes they added it to dough, making heavy flatbreads. Sometimes they thinned it with water and boiled it into soup. And sometimes, like today, they ate it as is, spiced with a bit of onion or wild garlic and topped with a dollop of sour milk. You try it with a smear of bog butter and a pinch of dried juniper. It doesn't improve the taste exactly, but it complicates it, which feels like a win. Later, you help prepare a midday version. Barley mash mixed with leftover broth, fried goat fat, and a generous handful of crushed herbs. The result is less porridge and more grain stew. Rich, greasy, smoky. A little like chili made by someone who's never met beans or tomatoes. It fills your belly like cement and leaves you ready to chop wood, row a boat, or fight your cousin over a sheep inheritance. Beer mash wasn't just a human food either. It was fed to animals, used as compost, and in some cases even burned as fuel. But for humans, it was the great equalizer, eaten by the rich and the poor, the warrior and the weaver. It didn't matter who you were. If there was ale, there was mash, and someone was going to eat it. You sit with an old man who tells you about feast mornings. After a night of drinking and shouting and probably a regrettable song or two, wake up, he says, and you eat the mash. Warm, heavy, keeps the thoughts from shaking out of your head. You laugh. He's not joking. As the sun creeps higher, you help prepare a version served cold. Leftover mash pressed into small cakes and grilled over the fire. They're crisp on the outside, soft in the middle, and surprisingly good. The fermentation gives them a sour edge, almost like rustic sourdough pancakes. You eat 3, then pretend you only had 1. A boy brings you a drink, whey beer. It's exactly what it sounds like. Sour whey mixed with leftover mash water and left to sit just long enough to fizz. It's tart, slightly sweet, and refreshingly weird. You ask if it's for children. He shrugs. If they can hold it down. One woman shows you how to make travel mash. The leftover beer grains are dried into flat cakes and stored for long journeys. Just break them up, boil in water or broth, and boom, emergency stew. She lets you taste a piece. It's like chewing on cardboard soaked in regret. but on a freezing fjord with nothing else around, you can imagine it feeling like gold. Quirky fact: in some areas, fermented mash was mixed with herbs and honey, then stuffed into a pig's stomach and buried for months to age. It was a delicacy, or a dare, hard to say. No one's making that today, but the legend remains, and you're almost glad not to test it. There's debate among historians about just how intentional these mash meals were. Some argue they were last resort filler food, made only when times were tight. Others suggest they were a regular part of daily life, woven into the Viking routine like bread or porridge. Evidence leans toward the latter. Archaeological sites have turned up carbonised mash in cooking pots, and saga literature hints at dishes that sound suspiciously like grain stews laced with ale dregs. By dinner time, you've eaten beer 3 ways: hot mash, grilled cakes, and a fried barley ball stuffed with lamb fat and herbs. You don't feel drunk, you feel solid. Like if someone challenged you to a rowing contest, you'd at least make it halfway across the bay before collapsing. The meal ends with a strange little dessert: barley mash mixed with dried berries and wild honey. It's sticky, chewy, and, dare you say it, delicious. The tang of fermentation, the sweetness of honey, and the burst of berries combine into something that almost feels intentional. Like they weren't just surviving, but inventing, creating. You sit back on your bench, staring into the fire, bowl in hand. Around you, the longhouse is quiet, bellies full, spirits warm, not from feasting, but from grain, humble, fermented, leftover grain. It's easy to dismiss beer mash as peasant food, a byproduct, a way to avoid waste. But here, in the flickering light of a fire that's seen 100 winters, it feels like something more. It feels like tradition, like sustenance, like the soft heartbeat of a culture that didn't just eat to survive, but to endure. You've been avoiding the cellar, not out of fear exactly, but let's just say every time someone mentions it, they also mention words like sprouted, soft-bottomed, or almost still good, which aren't descriptions anyone wants near their food. But today, there's no more delaying. The winter stores are almost gone, and it's time to see what's left in the root cellar. You follow 2 villagers to a small wooden door set low into the hill behind the longhouse. It's half covered in moss and looks like a place goblins might rent. One man lifts the latch, the other pulls the door open, and a cold, earthy breath exhales out of the dark. You duck inside. The smell is immediate: damp soil, mould, and something sharp and vegetal. The walls are stacked with baskets and crates. Some are empty. Some hold mysterious lumps wrapped in straw. You shine a little oil lamp over the goods. Turnips, or what used to be turnips. Some are sprouting little white horns. Others are sagging, their skins wrinkled like old men in bathwater. You pick one up and give it a sniff. It's not dead, just aged. It'll still cook. You tell yourself that enough times that it starts to feel true. Root vegetables were the backbone of the Viking diet, especially in the colder months when green things went extinct. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, skirret, and now forgotten sweet root, and even the occasional beet. They were grown in short summer bursts, then buried deep and hoped over. The cellar wasn't just storage, it was survival in a hole. You helped dig through the crates, setting aside anything too soft, too black, or too alien-looking. A handful of small onions and a dried garlic bulb make you feel like you just found buried treasure. A shriveled apple falls out of a straw bundle. It's wrinkled like a raisin, but intact. You polish it on. Your cloak can take a bite. Sour. Woody. Still. Food. Outside, the kitchen fire is already lit. The plan is to make a stew with whatever you brought up. You start peeling turnips with a knife that looks more ceremonial than practical. The skins come off in soggy ribbons, and inside the flesh is firm but waterlogged. They're boiled first to remove the worst of the bitterness, then chopped and thrown into a pot with barley, dried lamb, and sour whey. You taste it after an hour. The turnip has mellowed. It's soft, sweetish, with an edge of earthy funk. Carrot adds brightness, the onion adds depth, and the garlic, your glorious shriveled garlic, adds life. Turnips, you learn, weren't just fallback food. They were reliable, predictable. You could grow 100 of them in poor soil, let them sit all winter, and still have enough to get you through spring. In some communities, they were even celebrated. One elder says his mother used to carve faces into them and hang them over the door to ward off hungry spirits. ugly turnip keeps death away," he says, completely serious. You laugh. Then you realise he's not joking. A quirky tradition. Fermented turnips. Some were chopped and soaked in brine with juniper or sea salt, turning sour over time. Eaten cold, they were a crunchy, nose-wrinkling side dish, perfect for blood sausage or roasted goat. You try a slice of one from a stone jar. It bites back. Sour, sharp, slightly sweet. You immediately want more. And don't forget about skirret, now almost extinct in culinary circles, but once common in Norse gardens. It's a root that tastes like a cross between parsnip and mild sugarcane. They grew in clusters, were boiled, roasted, or even mashed. One villager brings out a jar of skirret mash cooked with sour cream and honey. It's a strange, sweet comfort food, tasting like a cross between pudding and mashed carrot. You finish your bowl and almost cry. You hear about another root, celandine tubers. Not common, and often toxic unless prepared correctly, but used medicinally. Vikings weren't just foragers, they were experimental. If it grew underground and didn't kill you right away, someone tried cooking it. You help with dinner prep, this time stuffing a handful of soft turnips with herbs and wrapping them in cabbage leaves before roasting them in hot ash. The result? Steamed parcels of vegetal sweetness with a hint of bitterness. You dip yours in thick sour butter and feel something close to joy. There's some academic debate over the role root vegetables played in Viking agriculture. Some researchers believe they were widely cultivated and essential to long-term survival, while others suggest their use was more opportunistic, gathered from the wild or grown in small patches near homesteads. Archaeological evidence is tricky. Roots don't fossilise well, but traces in latrines, seed pits and cooking vessels suggest they were common, even if not romanticised in the sagas. What is clear? They were dependable. When the meat was gone, when the fish had spoiled, when the grain was infested with beetles, you still had a pile of knobby, weird-smelling roots to boil. Dinner is served in wooden bowls, turnip and barley stew topped with a lump of dried skyr and a drizzle of sheep fat. Beside it, a slice of roasted parsnip with a smear of sweet skirret mash. You eat slowly, soaking up the warmth and the feeling of full-body stability that only root food can bring. There's no sugar rush, no zing, just deep, quiet nourishment. Afterward, someone slices a baked apple in half and fills it with melted bog butter and a pinch of ash salt. It's not dessert, but it's not dessert either. You eat it with your fingers, juice dripping down your wrist, and feel thankful for every ugly root that made it through the winter. You crawl into bed that night feeling like a tree, grounded, heavy, and vaguely orange inside. You've been powered by roots, sustained by what the cold could not kill, and as your eyes drift shut, you dream of soft-bottomed turnips and the dirt-sweet breath of the root cellar, keeping watch beneath the earth. You're beginning to recognise patterns. A certain smoky heaviness in the air means meat is drying. A sticky, sweet tang means someone's fermenting fish. And today smells like mystery wrapped in dust. You step outside to see a cart rolling into the village, creaking under the weight of burlap sacks, wicker baskets, and a pile of animal skins tied down with rope. A trader has arrived. And not just any trader, one from far to the south, with dark hair, brighter clothes, and a mouth full of strange words. The villagers gather, curious but cautious. The man unwraps his goods slowly, dramatically. Dried figs tumble from a basket, a handful of wrinkled dates, something that looks like hardened honeycomb. The crowd murmurs. Then he lifts a small bag and opens it to reveal nuts. Real nuts. Almonds, maybe even hazelnuts. No one breathes for a moment. This is not normal food. These are the weird imports. The stuff that came over oceans and through barter lines stretching across a continent. In a world where your pantry usually consists of roots, dried fish, and an ever-changing cast of pickled nightmares, these foods are alien, dried, sweet, possibly magical. You're handed a fig. It's wrinkled, dusty, and sticky to the touch. You bite in, and the sweetness hits your tongue like a lightning strike. It's soft, chewy, packed with seeds that crunch faintly. Your brain can't quite process what's happening. It's fruit, but fruit that's been to the underworld and come back with a story. The figs are traded quickly, half a smoked lamb leg for one pouch, then the nuts go. Someone gives up a jug of sour ale and a bundle of sheepskin. A woman offers wool dyed in wild onion and bog iron. You watch as dried raisins, slightly mouldy but still sweet-smelling, change hands like treasure. You try a few. They're chewy, tart, bursting with a fermented sort of sweetness that makes your teeth ache. They're nothing like the roots you've been gnawing, and that's the magic. These foods don't fit into the Viking world. They disrupt it, in the best way. Someone cuts open a dried fig and stuffs it with skyr and a few wild berries. You take a bite and nearly weep. Is this dessert? Is this what joy tastes like? It's decadent in a way nothing else here is, like a tiny feast packed into a mouthful, but not everything goes over well. The trader hands a man a piece of dried citrus rind, and the reaction is immediate. He spits it out, muttering about ghost fruit, and scrubs his tongue with a piece of toasted barley. Not all southern luxuries translated. Some were too strange, too foreign to enjoy. But still, people tried. There's a pouch of small, dark seeds. The trader says they're from a far-off place. Caraway or maybe coriander. They smell warm, almost nutty, with a hint of citrus. These aren't part of the local spice rack. You sprinkle some into a bowl of stew that evening, and the flavour tilts sideways. Familiar yet strange. Viking fusion, if you will. Later, the trader pulls out a block of something dark, glossy and dense. Fruit paste, he says, though no one knows exactly what fruit. It's sliced thin and shared. It tastes like time and distance, sweet and sharp and slightly bitter. It lingers on your tongue long after the meal is over. Here's the quirky twist. These foods, once introduced, sometimes sparked imitations. A village might dry its own apples and press them into sticky cakes to mimic the imported date blocks, or grind up nuts and mix them with honey and ground barley into something not unlike an energy ball. Was it the same? Not quite. But it was good, and it was theirs. There's an ongoing debate among historians about how common imported foods were in Viking life. Some say only the wealthy, jarls, traders, high-status warriors had access to these goods. Others argue that while rare, imported foods trickled down through trade networks and showed up in more humble homes, especially in port towns and coastal villages. The archaeological evidence is mixed. Bits of exotic seeds and traces of non-native fruits appear in latrines and midden heaps. But that doesn't prove they were common, just that they were memorable, and that's the point. These foods weren't staples, they were events. Tonight the village hosts a small gathering in honour of the trader. A fire is lit. Ale flows freely. Someone roasts a duck with juniper, and dresses it with a glaze made from fermented berries and honey, clearly trying to impress. The nuts are ground and mixed into a mash with butter and barley. A sweet porridge is served, spiced with imported caraway. Everything tastes just a little different, just a little luxurious. Even the bread, usually dry, heavy and moral, is soft tonight, made with finely ground flour and dipped in honey. You chew slowly, letting the sweetness linger. You forget about bark and blood and lichen for a moment. One girl tells a story about a prince who swallowed a golden date and dreamed of foreign stars. Another claims figs can make you invisible. A boy says raisins are what gods eat when they're tired of goat. You laugh. But in your heart, you get it. These aren't just snacks. They're glimpses of a bigger world, of warmth and colour and markets where fruit comes dried and nuts are carried like treasure. As the fire dims, you nibble the last piece of fig-stuffed skyr and stare into the embers. Sweetness here isn't just flavour, it's meaning. A reminder that even in a world of snow, smoke and survival, something unexpected can still arrive wrapped in cloth and make you believe in magic, even if only for a bite. There are some foods you can mentally prepare for. Bark bread, you brace yourself. Fermented fish, you accept the risk. But what lands in front of you tonight defies preparation. It's a large bubbling pot thick with steam and grease, and the smell crawling up from it is complex. Meaty, yes, but also earthy, gamey and undeniably snouty. You're having pig snout stew, an eel pie. Two culinary experiences that, until now, you hadn't imagined could share a table, or your future indigestion. It starts earlier in the day, with the butchering of a small pig. You're not there for the messy part, but you arrive just in time to watch a woman meticulously remove the snout and ears. She cleans them with care, scraping bristles and inspecting cartilage like it owes her money. The snout is thick and firm, padded with fat and connective tissue. She explains, almost lovingly, that it needs to be simmered for hours to go tender. Like a root, she says, but with bones. Into the pot it goes, along with ears, trotters, and any other part that wasn't already smoked or dried for winter. A few sprigs of juniper, a pinch of salt, a whole lot of bubbling broth. You add a few dried onions and parsnips, and hope they balance out the fact that you're stewing facial features. While that simmers, attention turns to the eels. Caught this morning from the riverbank using hand-woven traps, they're long, slick and muscular, like snakes with a smug attitude. One man handles them like old friends, gripping them behind the head and slicing with confidence. You're told eel meat is rich, oily, and warming, perfect for cold nights. The cleaned eels are cut into chunks and placed in a wooden bowl where they marinate in sour ale and wild garlic. Then comes the pie crust. And here's the twist. It's not for eating. This is a hard, unleavened dough made from barley flour and water, baked around the filling as a vessel, not a dessert. Viking pie crusts were more armour than pastry, there to seal in flavour and heat, not delight your inner pastry snob. Chunks of marinated eel are mixed with leeks, herbs, and a glug of skyr, then wrapped in the dough, pinched shut, and placed near the hearth coals. The crust blackens, the inside steams, and you try not to imagine how many things in this room have been cooked in the same pot. By evening, the longhouse smells like a butcher's shop crossed with a fish shack. The pig snout stew is ladled out first. You stare into your bowl, and there it is, a chunk of snout, cartilage still visible, swimming with turnips and glossy beads of fat. You bite in. It's gelatinous, tender, oddly luxurious. The flavour is deep, piggy and rich. Not pork chop rich, but ancestral, prehistoric rich. Your teeth sink into soft fat and a hint of crispy edge, like the nose tried to become bacon and almost succeeded. You try the ear next. It's chewy, really chewy. You chew for a long time. It has the texture of rubber with ambition, but the broth has soaked it through with warm, savoury spice. A man beside you eats his like a Viking potato chip. Crunch, crunch, swallow. You nod respectfully. Then the eel pie is served. They crack the crust open with a knife like breaking into an ancient tomb. Steam curls out, thick with the smell of river and herbs. You peel away the blackened shell and find chunks of pale meat nestled in green onion and bubbling cream. You take a bite. It's oily, decadent. The eel tastes like fish trying very hard to be steak, rich, silky, and full of character. The garlic adds sharpness, the leeks round it out, and for a moment you forget you're eating a creature that probably tried to escape its trap 5 times before giving in. And here's the thing. These aren't joke foods. They're not dares. They're dinner. Every piece of the animal, every slippery fish, every odd, jiggly bit of cartilage is used, seasoned and served. Nothing wasted. Not even the crust you're supposed to throw out. You see someone dipping it in stew anyway, teeth working overtime to make it yield. There's a story that floats around the longhouse after the meal, about a farmer who survived an entire winter on pighead alone. Every part used, nothing spared. Brain boiled and spread on bread. Jowls fried crisp. Eyes. Yes, again with the eyes. Eaten with vinegar and pride. He lived, someone says, because he ate the whole truth of the animal. You sit back, full and humbled, gnawing the edge of your eel pie's sacrificial crust. You're starting to get it. There's scholarly debate, of course, about just how common dishes like these were. Some argue that eel was a luxury, found mostly near rivers, or traded in from coastal towns. Others suggest it was more widespread, an oily, reliable fish that could be smoked, preserved, or cooked fresh. As for pig snout stew, written records are thin, but oral traditions and later Scandinavian recipes suggest it has deep roots in peasant foodways. A dish not written down because it was too normal to be noteworthy. A quirky tidbit. Some Norse rituals involved offering animal heads to the gods, sometimes cooked, sometimes raw. The snout especially was symbolic of resourcefulness, or stubbornness. Depends on who you ask. Back at the fire, the remaining broth from the snout stew is thickened with grain and served in wooden mugs as a late-night snack. You sip it. It's rich and calming, like drinking from the memory of a well-fed ancestor. The eel bones are dried and stored, to be ground into fish meal or maybe used as needles. Someone's already scraping the leftover crust into the goat trough. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is going to waste tonight. You lie down, belly full of stew and pie, eyes heavy, lips greasy, and brain slightly stunned by how weirdly satisfying it all was. You've eaten the nose of a pig, the ear, the slippery meat of a river snake wrapped in burnt bread. And it all made sense. Because here, food isn't just about taste, it's about respect, ingenuity, the quiet pride in making every bite count, even if it used to squeal or squirm. By now you've seen just about every animal part turned into something edible, or at least edible adjacent. You've chewed on cartilage, crunched dried fish spines, and swallowed fermented things that looked like they needed an exorcist. But there's one category of food you haven't fully experienced yet. Plants. Not the nice ones. Not the herbs or berries, the weeds, the leaves, the bitter things that grow in ditches and make you question every decision that led you to this point. Tonight you dine like a Viking forager in late spring, when the fields are full of wild greens that no one really wants to eat. But they do anyway, because the alternative is a slow and uncomfortable starvation. You join a group walking out of the village toward a grassy clearing that smells like damp earth and stubborn optimism. It's early spring, the sun still barely warming the ground, and the foraging begins. You're handed a woven basket and a rough list, spoken not written. Sorrel, nettle, dandelion, goosefoot, and the one that smells like feet but tastes like onion. You pretend to know what that means. Nettles come first. You spot them immediately because someone else grabs a handful barehanded and immediately regrets it. You use gloves, wrapped cloths, and snip the top leaves. Young nettles sting less, and after boiling they're soft, earthy and high in iron. Also, if prepared poorly, they'll leave your mouth tingling like a bad relationship. So, stakes are high. Next comes sorrel, bright green, arrow-shaped leaves with a sharp, lemony flavour. It grows in clusters near wet ground, and you can already imagine it helping to cut through the fat of, say, salted puffin or snout stew. You chew a leaf. It zings your tongue with unexpected freshness. You almost smile. Dandelion leaves are next. They're everywhere, bitter, bristly, and accused of being useless in modern lawns. But for Vikings, these were free greens, full of vitamins and attitude. They're best, boiled or mixed with stronger flavours to hide the bitterness. You gather a large handful, careful to avoid the bits chewed on by goats, or worse. You also collect wild chives, thin, tough grass with an oniony bite, and something that might be wild celery or might be a mistake. You sniff it. It smells like soil and nervousness. You keep it anyway. That's the Viking spirit. Back in the longhouse, preparations begin. First, the nettles. They're boiled with barley and whey to make a thick green porridge that smells like spinach met mushroom in a smoky cave. You're told it's good for blood, bones and curses. You eat a spoonful. It's vegetal, deep, slightly gritty. But it tastes alive, which is more than you can say for yesterday's eel pie crust. Next is a salad of raw sorrel, dandelion and chives, tossed with vinegar made from fermented apples and a drizzle of hazelnut oil. It's sharp, bitter, bracing, like salad served with a slap. But the brightness cuts through the heavier foods you've been eating for days. Your body seems to welcome the leafiness like an old friend returning from exile. Then comes the stew, a wild green soup made with turnip tops, goosefoot, and a stray radish or two, thickened with old beer mash and seasoned with crushed mustard seed. It's murky. It smells like grass clippings and ambition. You sip it and find yourself warming to the flavour. It's slightly sour, deeply herbal, and strangely comforting, like a tonic disguised as dinner. Someone passes around a side dish, steamed nettle cakes mixed with mashed oats, wild garlic, and a hint of skyer. They're dark green, soft, and vaguely resemble mossy pancakes. You try one with a slab of smoked butter and immediately want another. Turns out, the weeds are the meal. A young girl offers you a forest roll, a flatbread topped with boiled chervil, birch leaves, and an ash-roasted egg. You raise an eyebrow, but it's delightful. The chervil adds a touch of aniseed flavour, the birch leaves are bitter but floral, and the egg ties it all together with soft, yolky goodness. You eat it in 3 bites and feel vaguely healthier, like maybe your bones creak slightly less now. One of the elders grates a dried root, something sharp and minty, and mixes it into a paste with vinegar. "We eat this before hard labour," she says. You take a dab, your sinuses clear, your soul twitches. It's got the intensity of horseradish and the passion of an angry woodland spirit. You love it. And here's a strange historical fact. Viking foragers sometimes dried wild greens and ground them into meal to mix with flour, creating something between bread and chlorophyll. These green cakes were especially popular in lean seasons. You're given one, it's chewy, slightly rubbery, it tastes like grass and bark and guilt, but again, it's food. And in winter, that meant survival. There's debate among scholars over how widely greens were used. Some argue they were a staple, gathered regularly and worked into soups, porridges and teas. Others think they were more seasonal, occasional or even medicinal, used when meat was scarce or illness struck. What's clear is that the Vikings understood plants, not just the fun ones like berries and mushrooms, but the bitter, fibrous ones that required patience, knowledge, and a really strong jaw. Quirky side note: birch leaves, when young and tender, were sometimes chewed like gum, mildly bitter, astringent, and said to freshen breath. You try it. It tastes like licking a tree that's judging you. But hey, mint wasn't always an option. Dinner ends with a surprise: a sweet green pudding made from sorrel and honey, mixed with ground nuts and a little fermented barley. It's like eating a meadow in spring. Fresh, sweet, and a bit tangy. You clean your bowl. Later, lying on your straw mattress, belly full of leaves and roots and chlorophyll dreams, you reflect on just how wrong you were to underestimate the humble weed. These weren't scraps. They were strategy, resourceful, rich in flavour, and more essential than the fanciest imported fig. The Vikings didn't just survive on meat and mead, they survived on ditches, on forest edges, on the stubborn, bitter plants that refused to die, just like them. The next morning greets you with a breeze thick with smoke and salt, the kind of coastal wind that wraps itself around your skin like a cold, wet rope. You stretch, yawn, and realise that something smells, dare you say it, pleasant, like sweetness, like roasted sugar, like someone left honey near a fire and forgot to feel guilty about it. This is not the smell of snout or nettle or fish funk. This is something indulgent. You follow the scent like a hungry cartoon character, trailing it to a woman crouched beside a fire, stirring something thick and golden in a clay pot. "Honey cake," she says, barely looking up. "You're just in time." Your mouth says, "Thank you." Your stomach says, "Finally." Viking sweets weren't a daily occurrence. Sugar, as you know it, didn't exist here. No cubes, no crystals, no adorable packets with pink lettering. But the Norse had honey, and with it, they made magic. Not every day, not even every week, but on feast days, weddings, or the rare occasion when you managed to raid someone wealthier than you, then you might eat dessert. The woman stirs the pot of honey until it bubbles. She's mixed it with barley flour, goat milk, and a pinch of dried berries. No eggs, no baking powder, no fluffy rise, just slow heat and old-world patience. The scent deepens. You inhale greedily. She spreads the mix onto a flat slate warmed in the fire, then sprinkles crushed hazelnuts and dried crabapple on top. It sizzles as it cooks. You sit nearby, barely resisting the urge to hover like a seagull. The edge is crisp, the middle stays soft, and soon she's slicing it with a wooden blade into uneven squares. You get the first one. It's warm, sticky, dense. The honey coats your tongue in sweetness, and the grains add a satisfying chew. The dried apple is tart, the nuts earthy, and you honestly don't care if this is authentic or not. This is good. This is what your ancestors would have bribed Odin for. You ask how often they make it. "Not often," she replies. "Honey's precious. Good for wounds, good for sore throats, good for keeping meat from becoming other things." She tells you about how honey was sometimes layered on meat to help preserve it, or smeared on burns, food and medicine rolled into one golden miracle. Later you help make another treat. Milk curds mixed with honey and berry paste, rolled into small balls and left to chill on a stone slab. They're soft, a little tart, and melt in your mouth like Viking cheesecake. There's no crust, no caramel drizzle, just clean, honest flavour. You eat two and pretend it's for research. Another man offers you what he calls sweet barley chew. It's barley grain boiled in mead until swollen and sticky, then flattened and smoked over heather. It's part candy, part fuel. It tastes like a granola bar's feral cousin. You chew it until your jaw aches, but the warm honey mead flavour makes it worthwhile. They also have fruit leather. No, not the shiny kind wrapped in plastic. This is sun-dried berry mash, pressed onto bark or slate, and turned over daily until leathery and tangy. You tear off a strip, it's tough, it sticks to your teeth, it's sour enough to make your eyebrows twitch. You love it, it tastes like effort. A quirky discovery? Vikings sometimes used tree sap as chewing gum. Birch sap in particular, lightly sweet and antiseptic, was chewed by children and adults alike. You try a lump of the stuff. It's woody, slightly minty, and tastes like the forest is trying to have a conversation with your teeth. Not exactly a snack, but not bad either. And then someone brings out the mead. Not the high-alcohol Renaissance fair kind you're picturing. This mead is light, barely fermented, more like a sweet beer than a wine. But it's golden, warm. It carries the flavour of flowers and bees and long sunlit days. You sip it with your honey cake, and suddenly the sour barley stew from last week seems like a bad dream. Historians debate how common these sweets were. Some claim they were rare luxuries, only appearing at festivals or in the halls of chieftains. Others argue that simpler versions, like honey on bread or sweet curds, were everyday treats when resources allowed. Honey has been found in burial goods, in comb fragments, in jars sealed for centuries. It mattered, not just for flavour, but for ceremony, for celebration. You ask about feasts. There's always something sweet at the end, someone says. To remember the good, not just the hunger. It hits you then. Dessert in this world is not just a dish. It's a mood, a statement, a sign that you've endured enough to earn joy. As the fire burns low, more honey is poured over leftover skyr and mashed hazelnuts, stirred with a carved spoon and offered in wooden cups. It's not fancy. It's not light. But it coats your belly with a richness that says stay alive. It gets better. You lie back on the grass, belly warm, lips sticky, breath sweet enough to attract bees. You look up at the stars, thinking about all the Vikings who might have lain in this same spot, feeling the same full contentment from something as simple as roasted honey and grain. They didn't need sugar. They had sun in a jar. The wind has changed. You can feel it in your bones, in the brittle sway of the trees, in the way the smoke from the hearth leans hard to the east. A hush has settled over the village, not from fear, but from preparation. You're told that the raiding party returns tomorrow, tired, hungry, hopefully richer, and tonight is all about readying the feast. Not a harvest festival, not a wedding, not a seasonal rite, just a celebration of coming back alive, which in the Viking world is never guaranteed. You've seen scraps of feasts already, tasted the side dishes and day-after stews, but this is the main event. The whole village is involved. Fires are stoked, animals are butchered, grain is ground in shifts, and someone's finally digging into the good honey. You pitch in where you can, hauling firewood, skinning root vegetables, and only mildly messing up the barley dough. They don't trust you with the knives anymore, but you've been promoted to strong stirring, which you take as a win. The centrepiece of the feast is a whole roasted lamb, not smoked, not dried, not boiled until it forgets its name. Roasted with juniper, salt, garlic, and wild thyme packed into its belly. You watch as it's skewered on a spit, suspended over a deep pit lined with hot stones, and slowly turned for hours. The fat drips into the coals, sending up bursts of savoury smoke that cling to your hair and cloak like perfume. You keep licking your lips without meaning to. Beside the lamb, they're preparing stuffed flatbreads, barley and oat dough rolled thin, then filled with a mix of wild greens, mashed turnips, and bits of smoked goat cheese. These aren't the dense survival cakes you've choked down before. These are soft, pliable, and actually delicious. You're allowed to taste one before dinner, and you consider hiding it in your cloak for later. You don't, but you think about it. There's also a massive cauldron simmering with fish stew, this one not fermented mercifully. It's made with chunks of fresh trout, leeks, and herbs, thickened with beer mash and a spoonful of bog butter. Someone sneaks in a fistful of dried apples. You raise an eyebrow, but the woman stirs it with confidence. "Sweet cuts the fish," she says, tapping the ladle like a magic wand. At a separate station, younger villagers are slicing dried berries, pounding hazelnuts, and mixing honey into a grain, mash that smells like the dessert from a particularly intense dream. This will be the sweet porridge finale, topped with dollops of skyr and something they call fire syrup, just honey boiled with herbs until dark and sticky. You offer to help, and they let you stir. Your reward? A warm spoonful straight from the pot. It tastes like sunlight and rebellion. A man near the edge of the gathering is preparing drinks, mead obviously, but also something newer to you, ale laced with spruce tips and smoked barley. It's earthy and a bit sharp on the nose. You sip it and your tongue sings with pine and malt, and something that reminds you of chewing on wooden furniture. It's weird, but you go back for more. When the lamb is finally done, crisp-skinned, golden, dripping with its own happiness, the feasting begins. It's a loud, chaotic joy. Plates are shared, fingers are sticky, and no one cares about your elbows on the table, because there is no table. Everyone sits on the ground or on furs hunched around firelight and laughter. You tear off a chunk of lamb with your hands. It's tender, smoky, dripping with juice. The garlic and thyme sing through every bite. You dip it into a paste made from crushed berries and goat fat, and suddenly you understand how people end up writing songs about meat. You scoop up fish stew with flatbread. It's thick, warming, a perfect balance of sweet, salty and herby. The apple was a genius move, somehow brightening the fish without stealing the spotlight. You clean your bowl, then someone hands you another. Later, the dessert is passed around, a bowl of sweet porridge drizzled with fire syrup and topped with roasted nuts and a few candied spruce tips. You eat it slowly, savouring each bite like it might vanish if you blink too hard. It's not just tasty, it's luxurious, indulgent in a way Viking food rarely is. This is the treat you make when you know the ice is melting and tomorrow might not be terrible. As the night deepens, someone begins to sing. It's not a loud, boastful saga, it's a quiet tune, one that traces the memory of full bellies, lost friends, and the bittersweet taste of survival. You sit back, head heavy with food and drink, and listen. There's a debate among scholars about whether these kinds of feasts were frequent or rare. The sagas talk about them like they were weekly occurrences, ale flowing, meat roasting, halls echoing with song. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Feast dishes, fancy drinking vessels, and mass animal remains suggest large gatherings, yes, but likely reserved for seasonal festivals, weddings, and homecomings like this one. Some believe these feasts were as much political as they were culinary. A well-fed community is a loyal one. A chief who can fill bellies earns more than respect. He earns support, protection, even worship. And honestly, you see it tonight. The mood shifts from hunger to celebration to loyalty, over food, over fire, over the feeling that someone went through the effort to make the whole village feel human again. Your quirky takeaway for the night? The lamb is served with a side of bone marrow mash, a rich, creamy mixture scraped from roasted leg bones and blended with oats and herbs. It's delicious, and completely overlooked in most texts. But here, it's passed around with pride, slathered onto bread, licked from fingers, shared without ceremony, proof that even the smallest dish can be the soul of a feast. You lie down hours later, belly stretched, senses dulled by mead and meat and song. Around you snores rise, laughter fades, embers glow. And in the quiet, you realise something. This wasn't just a meal. It was a memory being stitched into the village's collective soul. A reminder that life, while often brutal, has its moments of warmth, sweetness, and roast lamb perfection. And you were here for it. You wake with the taste of mead still clinging to your tongue, and the smell of last night's fire tangled in your hair. The longhouse is quiet now, save for the soft shuffling of those brave enough to rise early. Outside, a seagull screeches like it's personally offended by your lingering hangover, and the wind carries with it the briny scent of another incoming tide. But your time here, your long, strange, unforgettable journey through the forgotten foods of the Viking Age, is drawing to a close. You stretch, slowly, cautiously, because your belly is still full of barley and lamb, and that dangerously addictive bone marrow mash. As you sit by the dwindling embers of the hearth, a cup of warm, sour milk in your hand, you reflect on what's passed through your mouth and survived your stomach. The bark bread that flaked like tree confetti, the fish so fermented it nearly walked off the plate, the wild greens that tasted like regret, and yet you loved it. Maybe not every bite, definitely not every smell, but the deeper truth of what food meant has sunk its roots deep into your bones. Because Viking cuisine wasn't just about flavour, it was about survival, ingenuity, and making use of everything, every root, every bone, every drop of honey and sliver of fat. It was a cuisine born from scarcity and carved into legend by necessity. and somehow, still, they found room for celebration, for dessert, for brewing joy into barley and hiding sweetness in stone jars. They left nothing wasted, not even the odd bits of eel or the greens no one else wanted. You think of the faces you met here. The old man who laughed as he popped a puffin egg into his mouth like candy. The woman who made wild berry porridge thick enough to stand a spoon in. The boy who taught you how to pick nettles without turning your fingers into regrets. These people aren't just characters from sagas, they're reflections of us. Hungry, clever, defiant, making dinner with what they had and calling it good even when it wasn't. So as you prepare to leave, your cloak packed. With nothing but soot and memories, you take one last look at the longhouse, the smokehouse, the salt-washed coast. This world of forgotten foods, of flavour forged in fire and frost, has changed how you see your own. Maybe your next meal won't include puffin or pig snout, but when you taste a piece of dried fruit or sip a dark, earthy ale, a part of you will remember, and it will taste like endurance, like history, like home.